members, I'd like to call the House Education Policy Committee to order. For members at the table, I brought bagels. That's why I got in here a few minutes later than I wanted to this morning. So there's bagels and cream cheese over there for everybody. Just to give you a layout for the day, we're going to do the first three bills. The first two are for informational only. That's how they've been posted, and we're taking an hour's worth of testimony ahead of time, half an hour for the proponents, half an hour for the opponents, and I was going to have Representative Mariani present his bill with a few testifiers and Representative Hassan present hers. We're not making any motion. They're informational only, but if there are some limited testimony in the audience, we can do that too if there's something somebody has to add. And then House File 3396, that is the one we're going to move, and then we'll start our agenda from there for bills that we are moving. After 3396, depending on what the time is, I want to give everybody a few minutes to stretch their legs, so we'll take a quick break. And other than that, I think we will get started. I believe we have some minutes in front of us from Wednesday, February 26th. Would anybody like to move the minutes? Representative Christensen moves the minutes from February 26th. Any discussion on the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? The motion prevails and the minutes for Wednesday, February 26th are approved. And then actually, we're going to start out, because I know is the commissioner here? She had wanted to give some opening remarks. We'll let you do that because I know you're on a tight time schedule. So why don't you go ahead and got about 5 to 10 minutes to do some quick opening remarks, and then we'll move on to our agenda.
Madam Chair, may I be recognized, please?
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make sure that the public knows that Rule 6.22 does allow for public testimony. And I see when I see the agenda that there is testimony, but it appears that it is not open to the public. So I want to make sure that the public knows they can testify, because these first three bills are controversial. We've had some of this before, but it is important that we hear from all sides when we're discussing, especially 2243. The other is that I would hope, Madam Chair, that since we're meeting past noon, that to adhere to Rule 6.20, that the Speaker has sent out a notice to all of us that she has granted permission for us to meet past 2, because that is also in our rules. I just want to get that on the record. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Erickson, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. That's why we're having an hour of testimony, 30 minutes for the proponents, 30 minutes for the opponents, and I will do limited public testimony too on the first two bills. They are from informational only. They will not be moved anywhere, and the meeting has been posted until 2 o'clock for almost a week now, and we did get permission. We're following up right now to find out if it should have been written permission, so I apologize to anybody, and we are going to move on. Commissioner Ricker, would you like to state your name for the record and proceed?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. My name is Mary Cathryn Ricker, and I am Commissioner of Education. And so, Madam Chair and committee members, thank you so much for the opportunity this morning to provide some more of my thoughts regarding student well-being and discipline. A critical component of Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan's vision for One Minnesota is for Minnesota to be the best state in the nation to raise a child. Part of accomplishing this vision is to ensure that every student has access to a safe and welcoming school environment. And when we say safe and welcoming, yes, we do mean the actual school building and its facilities, and it also means more than that. More and more, we are seeing research that shows an essential component of student success is their overall health and well-being. This includes physical and mental health, access to healthy and nutritious food, school climate, disciplinary policies, and more. I very much welcome the discussion and bills this committee will be having today around these important issues. Thank you very much. You have heard from the governor's policy bill that he and the lieutenant governor are making it a priority to update our approaches in such areas as discipline and school lunch shaming. The real leaders in this work have been the students, their families, and their educators who have called for an end to zero tolerance policies in our schools based on their lived experience and the lived experience of their classmates. And they have called for culturally affirming and welcoming climates in schools. and I am grateful for their voices leading this work. School communities across the state of Minnesota have made real progress in shedding the vestiges of zero tolerance in our classrooms and in our schools. We have more work to do together to end the conditions left over from zero tolerance once and for all. We can continue to take those steps today in partnership. When our students are struggling, we need to support our educators so they can address each situation with an understanding and welcoming approach that keeps our students in classrooms and in schools rather than out. When a student has a behavioral incident, if our policies instruct staff to act in a reactionary or negative manner, we are teaching our students that when they experience adversity, they should be reactionary or negative. We need to continue the progress our schools have made in implementing positive, multi-tiered systems of behavioral interventions and supports and those creation of welcoming climates, which are effective ways to close discipline disparities that are otherwise predictable on race, special education status, or LGBTQ+ identity, for example. Unfortunately, despite efforts to curtail this occurrence in our school lunchrooms, we are still hearing about students being stigmatized for having school lunch debt as well. This practice must also stop, and it is clear this requires stronger and clearer language about what are prohibited stigmatizing actions. Solutions should also explore how to relieve the unpaid meal debt burden school districts are experiencing. In many cases, they are relying on private fundraising or taking money out of the classroom to resolve these debts. It is incumbent for the state and legislature to tackle this issue, so I thank the committee for their willingness to engage and have this discussion. There are an array of other ideas around student well-being that are being discussed, and I applaud the chair and this whole committee and the committee members and the bill authors for bringing them to the forefront. As we move forward, the students and educators of the great state of Minnesota will only stand to benefit from the legislation being heard today. Madam Chair and committee members, thank you very much for the time this morning.
Thank you, Commissioner Ricker. Representative Scott, you had a quick question?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair, and we don't get to see the commissioner in here very often, so I just wondered if I might ask her a question.
Go ahead, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Madam Commissioner, thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
And I know you're a really busy lady. One of the issues that has been in the news recently is the proposed constitutional amendment that former Justice Alan Page and I'm drawing a blank on the Neil Kashkari brought forward. And I'm just wondering if, I've not heard where you stand on that proposed amendment. I just wondered if we might hear from you on that.
Go ahead, Commissioner Ricker.
Madam Chair, Representative, thank you so much for that question. I am excited that more people are engaged in the conversation, and I'm even more excited about the hearing today, for example, because I feel like there are things we can do immediately to better meet the needs of our students and our families. For example, making sure that we're enacting non-exclusionary discipline policies, making sure that we are not shaming students for having lunch debt. And so I am actually here today to really engage in the sorts of things we can do right away for students, and I welcome more people to the conversation about those sorts of things we can do immediately.
Thank you, Representative Erickson. Oh, Representative Scott, did you have a quick follow-up?
Yes, please. So do you or do you not support the proposed constitutional amendment?
Commissioner Ricker.
Madam Chair, Representative, I am welcoming the conversation, a deeper and a broader conversation engaging Minnesotans around how to better meet the needs of our students. And that's why I'm here today, to talk about the things we can do right now.
Thank you, Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here. My concern is that when you address one Minnesota, that you're bypassing the fact that we have local control. And I refer to disciplinary issues and having been in the classroom several decades and knowing my students as I did and having the ability to handle them as I knew them is more important to me than a state policy that comes down and dictates to us. I don't understand this approach when we think of one Minnesota. And would you comment on, please, why you're bypassing local control and maybe even taking away teacher control?
Commissioner Ricker.
Madam Chair, Representative, thank you so much for asking. We at the state of Minnesota get to set a vision for the sort of welcoming and inclusive environments we want our students to have. And then there is a robust amount of local control within that to design the sort of strategies teachers and school leaders will use to make sure that they're creating welcoming and inclusive environments for their students. It is absolutely the day-to-day work of a teacher to set that classroom climate. And then these non-exclusionary discipline policies, for example, are ways of setting a vision to say that unless there is risk of immediate harm, then we practice ways of redirecting behavior. We practice ways of re-engaging the energy in the classroom. We practice ways of de-escalating conflict in our school buildings. And so the vision is non-exclusionary discipline policies. The practicalities are that robust menu of local decisions that get made in a classroom and in a school building to make sure that we know what that looks like local by local.
Representative Erickson, one more
Thank
quick
you, Madam
follow-up.
Chair. Well, Commissioner, you just made the argument for why locals should be in control. And state policy is made by us here in St. Paul, and it needs to really be made by the decision makers within each school or each district or each charter. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Erickson. We both know that it is about balance. Thank you, Commissioner Ricker. Did you have any further comments?
No, except thank you very much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your work on all of these policies. Thank you very much.
Quick reminder too, please, members, feel free to get up and walk around. I know sitting for a long time is tough. There are bagels over there that I brought, so make sure you get some breakfast. And I think we're going to bring the first Representative Mariani up for House File 22. Actually, sorry, Representative Mariani, my fault. We are actually going to do testimony first, I think, is how we have it set up, or?
No, you're going now. Get up and
Oh.
go.
Make up your mind.
Representative Mariani, my fault. I thought we had the hour-long before and after. But, no, okay. So we're going to do Representative Mariani's bill first.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members, and if I had known bagels were coming, I would have had that early breakfast.
You can take one for later.
But I did get time with my wife, so it worked out really well for me, so.
Representative Mariani, would you like to explain your bill?
Yes, and I'm here to speak about House File 2243, and just very quickly on the Commissioner's testimony. Mostly ditto from me members, and I am, however, an author of the constitutional amendment, bill. Members, and Madam Chair, thank you for having this hearing and for the thoughtful way in which you constructed it and invited the public to participate in a conversation that unfortunately is made overly difficult when I don't think it's really that difficult. I really think that what we're talking about here is how do we create cultures and how do we use us as lawmakers to shape laws that empower and enable cultures that bring out the best of human relations inside our public classrooms and our public schools. And right now, I would contend that that relationship is horribly harmed in this state, as evidenced by the incredibly terrible, disparate racial outcomes when it comes to school and classroom expulsions and suspensions, removal from the learning environment. You know, the plain, ugly truth is that if you're a black kid in this state, you are, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but you are horribly, terribly more likely to be removed from the learning environment than your white peer and friend for pretty much the same kind of behavior exhibited in the classroom. I could tell you, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair, well, Speaker sounds good, Madam Chair and members, that posse communities, communities of people of color and indigenous communities, refuse to accept the idea, the notion, that their children are are much more likely to disrupt the learning environment than other children, than their white friends. I can also tell you that, and the Department of Human Rights has made this very clear in its actions in the last couple of years, compelling a number of school districts to come to a collaborative table to design a different and better way to do things. That the issue of the violation of basic civil and human rights of students is being perpetrated in this state on a daily basis as a result of the disparities in expulsions and dismissals. So this is a really vitally important conversation. Many of you know I direct a racial equity education nonprofit, the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership. And while I'm not here on their behalf, I'm here as a legislator. I can tell you that this legislation lines up strongly with their belief, our belief in that organization, that our challenge, in fact, our opportunity, is not to construct laws and have practices that aim to fix students, that aim to fix children, but rather that are aimed to fix systems. Systems, structures, and cultures shape the behaviors that are currently, well, they always shape the behaviors of people in any, in this case, at any school. But current laws, I would contend, enable a way in which those systems, those structures, and those cultures are producing what we're seeing in our state. So House File 2243 contributes to a redesign of how we structure relationships in our public schools among students and educators based on recognizing the civil and human rights of students. As we consider this and other bills, it is important to focus on the growing body of literature that points to how the use of punitive-based exclusionary discipline practices are an impediment for learning for any student, but it also is a huge contributor to racial disparities in educational outcomes given the racial biases that we carry. We all carry them. I carry them. I am a product of this society. Given the biases that we all carry as individuals and that manifests itself in systems behavior. Our duty is to construct law that shapes both how we hold individuals accountable for empowering student achievement and how we hold our systems to do the same. If school administrators have concerns with this bill, let me suggest to you, as someone who's been around here for a long time, that that's a good sign. Because what it does is it invites you to push the systems, structures, and cultures. That's what legislators ought to do, to push our systems that are currently producing these unacceptable racial disparities. So very quickly, I'll give you the highlights, and I'm going to shut up and ask my colleague, Josh Groshen, to speak and then introduce some students as well. Very quickly, it's a comprehensive bill. The highlights are, some of the highlights of the bill is that it adds a fifth performance measure to school district progress indicators of meeting the state's world's best workforce goals and accountability framework. So this isn't tinkering on the edges. This is an attempt to do redesign work at the very heart of our state accountability system. It defines non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices and alternatives to pupil removal and dismissal, requiring interventions and supports for students, and applying it to the recent legislation that currently merely permits certain practices in lieu of suspension. It empowers students and parents so that expulsion and exclusionary practices are not simply unilateral actions of schools, but involve notice, due process, and readmission procedures and relationships mandated between parents and students and school administrators. It requires schools to use non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices before expelling, excluding students. It removes current statutory language, providing broad, vague discretion that I contend leads to expulsion and exclusion. And it establishes a student inclusion grant program at the Department of Education to be used for promoting non-exclusionary discipline practices, including the learning of implicit and explicit biases that lead to expulsions and exclusions. This bill was constructed largely by the Solutions Not Suspensions Coalition, and it reflects the thoughts of a broad-based racial equity-focused community from across the state. So, Madam Chair, with that, I'll turn over my time to Mr. Crossan to make comments on the bill, and then we have some students testify.
Yes, thank you, Representative Mariani. Sorry, Mr. Crossan, we didn't have you on to testify, but are you just walking through the bill? real quick?
Yeah, Madam Chair, yes.
Great, thank you.
Josh Crossan. I'm just here to answer any questions that the members have. I just wanted to introduce myself. I just really quickly also say that at a time when we're having conversations about the right to a high-quality education being a possible constitutional amendment, that cannot exist when we're kicking students out of school for chewing gum or wearing their hair in a certain way. So in 1975, we created the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act. We have since, in this last 45 years, scaled back the due process and the rights of students when it comes to suspensions and expulsions. Like Representative Mariani said, this is a community-based initiative. Working with Representative Mariani's office and many of the people here today. But just a quick walkthrough, it creates clear definitions. It does not get rid of dismissals as a practice or a tool, but rather thinking about discipline in a different way. How can we improve student behavior without removing them from their constitutional right to an adequate education? It addresses bad practices altogether. 1,700 kids last year were suspended or expelled for attendance-related issues in Minnesota. That's a bad practice. We need to be addressing certain issues, which this bill does. It engages families in the process of discipline. And then creates an accountability measure. How are schools suspending and expelling differently from others? So with that, I just wanted to, we have 3 students from St. Louis Park High School to come and tell their stories of why this is important.
Thank you, Mr. Crossan. I'd have to also check our Constitution. I don't believe the word adequate is in there. But I would love to see the students from St. Louis Park come up, since I represent that area. And as you come up, right before you testify, just make sure that you state your name for the record, and then you can proceed with your testimony. You guys can decide who goes first.
Okay. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the House. My name is Olivia McClinton, and I'm a senior at St. Louis Park High School. I think that there are a lot of assumptions that light skins don't receive the same injustices that their more dark-skinned peers face. And yes, that's somewhat true, but colorism is definitely real, and you can find examples of that everywhere. But that doesn't mean that administrators don't already have a bias when they see me. I am a black woman, and that is obviously how you all see me in this room. Starting in kindergarten, my teacher would send me to the resolution room for doing things my other white peers would not get sent out of class for, like for something as little as talking during nap time. In middle school, I never got any out-of-school suspensions, but I remember getting a few times in school suspension, one time for throwing a pencil in the classroom. And then my junior year of high school, there was this grade level coordinator who had been targeting me over the span of the school year, and she would go into bathrooms after me and send me to the office to search my bag because it smelled like fruity flavors, even though I wasn't doing anything. And later that year, this GLC walked into the bathroom and saw a girl I was next to vaping, and I guess I was guilty by association and got suspended for a day of school, as well as being suspended for half of the lacrosse season's games. And another white girl on my team actually had also been suspended for the same reason, but she didn't miss any games. And being a very dedicated athlete, being suspended really had a negative impact on my mental health on top of an already rough year, junior year. And I don't understand how taking me out of class in my sport teaches me anything. And all it really did was prevent me from learning, growing, and getting better. I know my story is not as bad as some of my other black peers, but it does show that there is an obvious issue, and not just in my school district, but the 43 other school districts that were under investigation for violating the State Human Rights Act with discipline disparities. Students of color in all shades experience this kind of discrimination in school, and I think there really needs to be a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McClinton, for sharing your story. Go ahead and state your name for the record, and please proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the House. My name is Cynthia, but I go by Cece. And I will be telling you about how my school is racially unequal. My junior year last year, me and my best friend Shania decided to do an experiment on our school to prove how racially unequal they are. And the experiment was for me and my best friend, who is colored, and a non-colored student to wear the same outfit on the same day. The outfit that they wore was a tube top. What happened when my best friend got to school, she was wearing the tube top and the white student was wearing the tube top too. The teacher saw my friend and told her that she had to change or she would get sent home the same day. But when we brought up about the white student wearing the tube top, no one had seen her. Multiple teachers had told my friend every time they saw us that she had to either put on a jacket or she was going to be sent to the office. When we told them about the same student and her name, all of the teachers supposedly all of the teachers hadn't seen the student. So my friend wound up getting called to the office and they told her to cover up or she was getting sent home. She covered up so she wouldn't get sent home. After all that had happened, we did a project in our English class, and the project was to find something in the school that we thought we could fix or needed to be fixed and could make awareness about. So we did the dress code, because the dress code at our school enforcement is racist and students are getting sent home over it. So I made shirts that said in the front, "Our body is not a distraction," and in the back of it had a colored female with an afro, and her afro was made up of words. And that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Owens. Go ahead and state your name for the record and proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair and representatives. My name is Ari Belfour, and I'm a senior at St. Louis Park High School. I've done a handful of things that would be considered breaking the school rules. I've skipped class, got caught skipping class.
Can you pull the, I'm sorry, could you pull the microphone a little bit closer? Thank you. Thank you.
And the teachers didn't care. I've talked back to teachers and didn't get kicked out of the classroom. I've never been punished in any form during my entire school years. I've never been asked to leave school when doing something I'm not supposed to be doing, and I've never had to worry about how my decisions, no matter how big or small they are, will have consequences, because they never do. I've always been treated with respect. Students of color have the exact opposite experience with authority when doing the same things that I do, or even doing nothing at all. And it hasn't taken me long at all to figure out why. When a white student does something even as big as start a fight, the authority in my school turns the other cheek. When students of color simply have an argument, no violence involved whatsoever, they're suspended for 3 days. This happened last month. When you look at it in black and white, it almost looks like adults want to keep this stereotype alive that represents students of color to be less behaved than white kids. It also looks like racism, and I think it's a blatant example of it. The irony of having students not allowed to come to school as a consequence for something as mild as skipping class or truancy in general is ridiculous, and when you have students of color being the main target for that, you're taking away their education. Logically, it doesn't make sense to punish someone for skipping school by not letting them go to school. Just because St. Louis Park has a lot more diversity than other schools doesn't mean people are treated the same. We're ignoring the issue when we have statistical evidence of it in the newspaper. It says 63% of exclusions in St. Louis Park Middle School were African American students, and they only made up 21.7% of that population in 2018 and 19. White students made up 51% of that population. Administrators have the exact data to look at it, review it, and choose not to do anything about it or simply try. We need to try something else because how things are being handled right now isn't working. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Balfour. Thank you, Ms. Owens, and thank you, Ms. McClinton, for sharing your stories. Members, were there any quick questions at the table before? Representative Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, hey, thanks for your testimony. The Representative Mariani, my question's for you. Okay, you want to slide close?
Thank you, ladies.
Just looking at your bill, I see on page 7, minimum education services. School officials must give a suspended student an opportunity to complete all schoolwork assigned during the pupil's suspension and to receive full credit for satisfactory completing assignments. You know, when I was on the school board, we did suspend some students, but we did have a teacher work with the suspended students so that they could satisfactorily complete their assignments. So I think that's already being implemented. I don't know if it's in statute or not, but we did it in our school district.
Representative Mariani.
Madam Speaker, Representative Gruenhagen, there are, I don't know, over 500 school districts across the state. I don't think it's being practiced uniformly across the state. And I think it's important that this legislature speak through statute that this is our expectation of our school districts. I don't know if Mr. Crossan wants to add anything more. And the reason I had Mr. Crossan here is because he was instrumental in constructing this language.
Mr. Crossan.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative, it is not happening across the board. And if it was happening in your school district, that's great. We hope that the school districts that are acting well aren't impacted by the policies that we're trying to set this floor around. But across the board, we've heard cases of students missing work and missing the opportunity to gain credits, resulting in either not graduating on time or not being able to complete grade work to satisfactorily move up in their studies. So, no, it's not happening everywhere.
Thank you. Representative Gruenhagen, one quick follow-up.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I just want to address the discipline situations that have been shared too. You know, when I was in 9th grade, I got expelled from a classroom, and it wasn't my fault. Okay. Actually, it was the student next to me, and I did go along with it a little bit, but the teacher caught very little. But the teacher caught me and not the student that initiated. So guess what? I got expelled for about a week, all right? And I tried to explain both to the teacher and the administrator, but the teacher made the judgment call. These people aren't perfect, okay? And as far as dress code, when I was going to high school, if a young lady came with a shorter dress, she had to get in a push-up position, and if the dress didn't touch the floor, she had to go home and change clothes, all right? So we've come a long ways, all right, from when I was in school. You know, I just think the bill's over-prescriptive. It's a one-size-fits-all, and I realize you have good intentions. But the thing is, at what point do we need a superintendent administrators? I mean, we're paying these people to make these decisions. And the last thing I'd just say is this. One of the things I learned when I was on the school board for 16 years, okay, is that I would get complaints from parents or students. In fact, and one of the things I learned, you've got to hear both sides of the story. I understand we heard the student's perspective, but it would be interesting to me to hear the teacher or administrator that decided to make those, impose those consequences. I'd like to hear from them, because what I found in my experience on the school board, human nature being what it is, we tend to censor out information that makes our perspective look less viable. And I don't care whether it's a school district or a student or a parent. That's what happens. And I could give you several dozen situations where I heard one perspective, and by the time I heard the other perspective, it was completely modified or different than what I had heard originally. So again, I understand your intention, but to take this away, local control from the superintendent and the teachers, I think is completely misguided and will result in more problems, not less.
Representative Mariani, quick follow-up, and then I've got Representative Herr, Representative Erickson. I'm going to see if there's anybody that has anything to add. Reminder to the audience, this bill is not before us. I have not moved this bill. This bill is not moving out of committee. We are just having a conversation about it. We have another informational hearing after this on a similar bill, and then we actually get to the bill where we're actually moving, and that's when we're going to be taking the hour of testimony. So if you want to wait until the bill that's actually moving, that would be preferential. We have talked to those that have concerns. That's why we've structured it this way. But wanted to open up if you wanted to reach out to a page if there's something you feel like you have to add. Representative Mariani.
Yeah, Madam Chair and members, and thank you, Representative Gruenhagen, because I think this actually goes right to the heart of the issue, and in fact should be the conversation that we should be having. Madam Chair and members, we're not talking about isolated incidents here. We're talking about, as measured statistically across our state, we're talking about the product of a systems design. This is systemic behavior. Our job, I contend, as legislators, is to shape laws that influence the shape of our systems and the behaviors in our systems. And we absolutely count on the goodwill, the humanity, and the professionalism of everyone in our public school systems to take those big guidance and translate them into very, I would contend, human-centered, student-centered practices as professionals. So we're not talking about isolated incidents. The data is overwhelming that what we would identify as an individual act gets multiplied many times over across our state. And this really goes to the issue of implicit bias. It really goes to a deep dive in understanding how racism manifests itself in our society, and including guiding the behavior and the policies and practices of our systems, and then invites us to shape our laws with that knowledge. You know, the story, the narrative that CC gave, I think was incredibly powerful if you listen to it carefully. And it was just geniusly constructed, by the way, CC and your colleagues. And I've seen this constructed repeatedly across the nation for years. And the studies continue to confirm that it's almost like science fiction. You know, it wasn't that they literally didn't see the white student in the tube dress. It's that they didn't see her in terms of how they perceived her. That's what implicit biases are about. It's about constructing an image of reality. It gets filtered through the way we've been, quite frankly, all harmed to be able to translate reality. There's just no way, for instance, just to overstate the case, that in that situation, there's just no way that a young white girl, you know, could be doing anything wrong. But boy, you know, a young black girl, like, we've been conditioned to expect them to do something wrong. You know, I'm just being really blunt. because that's what the social science for decades has been telling us. So that manifests and appears in all our systems, including here at the legislature. Ask any of your women of color colleagues here. You know, it manifests itself in our public schools as well. So, Representative Gruenhagen, I love the question. It requires a much longer conversation than we have time for today, but I want us to have that conversation repeatedly here. It isn't that we expect people to be perfect. That's just like expecting people not to be human. What we should expect is for people to be aware, especially those who are interacting with our young citizens. What we should expect is that there are opportunities that are structured for people to learn to be aware and then to learn the practices that can counter their implicit biases. And then the final thing, because this issue of local control keeps coming up, you know, Madam Chair, I chaired this committee. Local control is just one of those, you know, like, you know, when I don't have an answer to anything, you know, I'm just going to throw local control at you. You know, my fellow legislators, do not apologize for directing any of our public institutions on what your expectations should be of them. We are the guardians of our people's trust and our people's resources. And let me tell you, there's a whole lot of things we do where, you know, locals are not going to be bothered by this argument of local control. They want us to make these decisions. They do. What they want is to have a relationship with us, not a dictatorial posture, but a relationship with us. But like any relationship, that should be based on us being real clear on core values. And one of them really ought to be, absolutely ought to be, that the human and the civil rights of our young people of color and Indian students, young people, shall not be violated by any of our public institutions.
Thank you, Representative Mariani. Representative Gruenhagen, very
Real quick.
quick follow-up. Then I have
I just wanna
Representative
say-
Herr, Representative Erdahl,
Yep.
and Representative Herr, Representative Erickson, Representative Erdahl, then Hassan. Then we are moving on to the next informational hearing.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Just one quick comment, implicit bias. I must have had an implicit bias when I spent 13 years on a voluntary basis in jail ministry, working with many minorities. I must have had an implicit bias when I have minority customers in my insurance agency. They can't afford their deductible, so I write a check out of my insurance agency. I must have implicit bias when I insisted that minority students, especially Hispanic, be taught intensive systematic phonics so they could learn English, so they'd have half a chance of improving their life down the road and becoming a part of the middle class. I must have had implicit bias. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Representative
very
Mariani.
quickly,
And then we're going to move on.
in an odd way, I agree with you. I have implicit biases. It doesn't make me bad, doesn't make you bad, doesn't make me good, doesn't make you good. It makes us the products of this society. You know, bless you and thank you for the work that you've done over the years. But that is not an argument that you are not affected and impacted by the way racism works in this society. I'm a brown guy, and I'm impacted by how racism has distorted how I view other people. Until we get to that conversation, we're not going to get policies right for everyone, for each and every one of these communities. We can't resolve these issues through one good Glenn Gruenhagen or one good Carlos Mariani. We'll take it, but we need systemic behavior to change as well.
And you know I
Thank you,
like
Representative Mariani. And I have Representative Herr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, I just wanted this comment to go to the students. I wanted to just thank you for coming in and sharing your stories. I really want to point out that in this space, this is a very white space in a very white institution structured for people making very white policies. And that when we walk into this space, it is extremely triggering to hear people say, let me tell you my story to invalidate your story, so that then your story becomes less effective. And that is not true. your story doesn't become untrue because somebody else decides to tell their story as to why you shouldn't feel okay with your experiences, and it makes you doubt yourself. Do not let that doubt you from continuing to speak your voice, because what we are not asking is for teachers to be perfect. We are asking for teachers to be fair. We are not saying every teacher is bad. We are not saying every school district is not doing this right. We are saying that there are people doing it wrong, and there are school districts not doing right by our students. You need to continue to speak your words. Do not let what is being heard today trigger you in feeling as if somehow you have done something wrong or you should be ashamed of your experiences. My Asian daughter came to school one day in a full top, it was covered up, and full jeans and Timbs. And she was made comments that her top was too low. But her white friend sitting right next to her had an extremely small top, much smaller, that was not covered up, and no one said a word to that child. This tells me that our stories are real, regardless if somebody else says, well, I was expelled and I don't look like you. Your story is real. And I just wanted to make sure that I point that out, because as I sit here and listen to what is being said, thinking that somehow any of us are excused from the implicit bias that exists. We are all socialized by the same institution that socialized white people, which means we are part of the system that upholds oppressive structures that are continually marginalize our black and brown students, that we cannot forget that, and it is upon all of us to dismantle those thought systems within our own heads, which means we need to do right. We need to create policies that look outside that. And so I just want to applaud the students. I want you to know that your stories are heard, and I want you to continue to speak that truth, because your truth can exist in the same reality that a truth for a white student that says the school system is fair to me. Those opposing truths can exist in the exact same reality. And I want you to never forget that. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you, Representative Kerr. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I, too, want to thank the young ladies for testifying and being so truthful with us. But I want them to know also that St. Louis Park was cited by the Human Rights Commission. And so I hope some changes are occurring, that there have been plans that have been prepared by that local district to change. If this is teacher behavior, that needs to change. But then to the commissioner, if we're one Minnesota, you should be responsible for sending out best practices to every district. We shouldn't have to legislate all this. I remember under Commissioner Casalius, she was very good about sending out guidance to local districts. So I would expect the same of you. Send out best practices to our districts so they can read and understand and train their teachers, because that's what One Minnesota becomes, is when the agencies are adhering to sending out the best practices so that they don't curtail local control. And a word to Representative Mariani and to you, Josh. You know, if you're going to change the world's best workforce and disaggregate data, we're not going to be one Minnesota, because we're going to be separating. And our goal should be, and I agree with Representative Hur, we shouldn't be quiet. But I want us to look at our children as our children, all of our children, not divided into race or gender or in any other group. These are our children. And I educated my students as they were all one. I didn't separate any of my races or genders or whatever. And I think that's the way we have to think about our children. Not divided into groups, or, you know, when we get into disaggregating data, I know we think we're going to learn something from it, but we divide Minnesota. We don't become one Minnesota. So, you know, and I want to make a comment too about it. You know, if I'm using non-exclusionary discipline policies in my classroom, what do I do with the rest of the students when I'm trying to use that one idea that might pop into my head? Because I have a whole classroom of high school students, for example, when I taught. And I have to be concerned about all of them. So, you know, I think if we teach a moral compass to our children so they know the difference between right and wrong, we emphasize character education, of which respect is one of the most important characteristics, you know, and embed that in our social emotional strategies, we're going to accomplish more than we are than coming up with these kinds of policies that I think are simply going to be divisive and divide us. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Mariani, did you have a quick follow-up? And then we're going to move on.
I'll be as concise as I can. One, I do want to thank the commissioner for sending out, for developing code of conduct guidance. There's a group at the department that's working on that. and your intent is, in fact, to provide guidance to the school districts. And so let's continue that work. You know, the other comment would take way too long, but it is an important conversation. And you know how I know it's important? Because we're entering into it in a very passionate way. That's how you know you're getting to the real stuff, you know, not just to the, you know, the superficial safe structural, conversations, as important as those are, but, you know, stuff that comes from here. You know, for communities of color and indigenous communities, all does not mean us. We understand that. And it may seem counterintuitive, but being able to distinctly see the very real differences that exist among us, and just as importantly, the very real false and destructive ways in which each of us have been defined, is how we get ultimately to a place where we're seeing each other fully as human beings. And that's the issue at play here, that we have professionals who are, they're professionals, they're good people for the most part, who are in our classrooms, but they're not immune from the fact that they, as me, you know, have been trained in a certain way to see people differently in negative, some in negative terms and some in positive terms. So when we say all, we don't really mean all. I know it's a difficult concept to get across for us. What we really mean is there is a white norm, and then there's those other people. Our challenge is how do we get past all of that? We can't get that unless we actually see the reality that's distinct in each and every one of these communities.
Thank you, Representative Mariani. I think you're right. We're getting a little deep before 10 a.m. in the morning. That's why I brought the bagels, or I should have brought pie. Who wants pie? But yes, you very distinctly, maybe we're forgetting sometimes that we don't need to see all the children as one. You made a very clear distinction between meeting children where they're at, which is equity, no matter who that child is, meeting and seeing them individually versus giving everybody the same. And that's a huge, deep conversation for later. And I want to move on and make sure that Representative Erdahl gets a chance to talk, Representative Hassan, and then we'll move over to the other informational hearing. Oh, you'll wait?
Save mine for my hearing.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Hassan. Representative Erdahl.
Thank you,
got
Madam
better
Chair. I'm much more shallow.
I am until I have my coffee.
Oh,
Yeah.
and unlike my renegade colleague, I was never suspended. Now, detention is another matter, but.
Line doesn't have.
All right. Quickly, first of all, as I go through this bill, there are some disagreements I will have and express later. But one question that I do have is the world's best workforce. When I proposed a change last year in adding a certain area that I was crusading on, it was like the sky had fallen in the objections that I received. And I see now a proposed change of the world's best workforce here. In the governor's policy, there have been proposals in the world's best workforce. I'm just wondering if Representative Marquardt was consulted at all about this, Representative Mariani.
Representative Mariani.
Representative Erdahl, no, and I totally empathize with your initiative and your position.
All right. Thank you, Representative Mariani.
Representative Erdahl.
Madam Chair, just quickly, I think that, first of all, disparity is wrong. Students should be treated alike for alike transgressions or accomplishments. And as I look back in my teaching career, I really can't compare much because I think there were 6 students of color in my school. But for schools that are much more even in that regard, I mean, it's simply a given fact. I think that they should be treated alike. So what I believe that you are striving for is a model of consistency. And I think Representative Herr was also along those lines. We should be consistent in how we treat people in this area and in how we teach other subjects, shall we say, to people.
Great, thank you, Representative Erdahl. And I do want to say, I lift up St. Louis Park too. I know Representative Osai was one of the first ones to the table to work with Department of Human Rights and to also work with the Reimagine vision with AMSD and the U of M. So they're working at it. So
Terrific leadership. Jeanette.
just, thank you. Thank you. We're going to have Representative Hassan bring up
Thank you,
her.
Madam Chair. And,
Thank you. I'm going to have Representative Hassan come forward to just chat about her House File 1761. Thank you. Representative Hassan, proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. I want to thank everyone who's having conversation about disparities, suspensions, and expulsions today. House File 1761 is an act relating to education providing non-exclusionary pupil disciplinary policies and practices and requiring a report. Before I start what this House File does, I just want to share with you some of the recent data that addresses the disparities in our school system. A recent analysis by the Department of Education found that the students of color make up about 31% of the population, yet those students receive 66% of all suspensions and expulsions in the last 5 years. In 2015-2016 school year, data reveals that American Indian students were 10 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white peers. African American students were 8 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white peers. Students of color were twice likely to be suspended or expelled, and students with disabilities were twice likely to be suspended or expelled than students without disability. We all care about education, and I'm sure every single one of us sitting here in this room is passionate about our students' academic achievement. And if we do care about education and the disparities are bothering us, then we also know that expulsion and suspensions contribute to the problem. If students are not in the classroom, that means they're not learning. And if they're not learning, then they can't achieve educational achievements. I want my children to struggle in life, said no parent ever on planet Earth. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, said MLK. For far too long, we've been talking about education disparities in Minnesota, so it's time to look for answers outside of the norm. We cannot and should not remove children from classrooms and expect positive outcomes. Are there schools that are doing great? Of course. Are there exceptional teachers and educators that are doing everything absolutely possible to give our students all the tools that they need to succeed? Of course. But this bill and the bill before addresses the thousands of educators and administrators who are not doing what they should have been doing. They say definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We must find different solutions to combat the education disparities and inequities in our educational system. This bill, 1761, is focused on, sorry, it's too early to be talking about disparities. Parent empowerment. It focuses on complaint process. I have 2 testifiers here, an expert and then a parent, and I will let them explain and we'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Representative Hassan. Go ahead and state your name for the record and proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is Maren Halden. I'm an attorney with Legal Aid, which includes the Minnesota Disability Law Center. We are the federally designated protection and advocacy organization for the state of Minnesota, which gives us funding to represent children and adults with disabilities in legal disputes and other proceedings. And so I've spent several years of my career representing students with disabilities on school-related issues, including many children with really significant behaviors who have been subject to exclusionary discipline. And one of the things that I learned through working with those children and families, two things. One is that most of the time when children were presenting really difficult behaviors in schools, it was a result of their underlying needs, often related to their disability or other needs that they have not being met. And so when teachers and staff could find ways to meet those needs, often those behaviors would end. The second thing that I learned in representing, working with families is just that those children's parents are some of the most committed, fierce advocates for their children. And oftentimes when their children are experiencing that kind of struggle at school, they have their relationship with the school, the trust has really fallen apart. And that makes it very difficult for the parent and the school to work together to support the student to be successful. And so that's why I'm grateful to be here with Representative Hassan and grateful to you for bringing forward this bill that includes a mechanism that would give more parents voice in the disciplinary process. Right now, in the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act, which includes many good protections, although I know you're here to talk about including it even more protections, if one of those protections is not followed, there is not currently a mechanism for a parent or family to do anything about that. And there's no mechanism either for the Department of Education to give clear feedback about specific incidents to districts about whether or not they are implementing the act as it's intended. And so what this House File 1761 includes, it includes several provisions that are similar to those in House File 2243, which you just discussed, and several that are similar to in House File 3396, which is up next. But the one we're focusing on today is on page 5, which would establish a complaint procedure. It's very similar and mirrored after the one that already exists for special education issues that allows parents of children with special education to notify MDE and ask MDE to investigate whether or not the special education procedures were followed in that specific incident, at which point MDE does an investigation and then issues a decision about what occurred, what laws apply, and whether or not those laws were followed. Most of the time in my experience, and I've helped parents file many of these complaints, if MDE finds that there was a violation, then they order the district usually to train their staff to not make that same mistake again. And if there's something applicable to the student that would help the student become whole as a result of what occurred, then they might order that too. But oftentimes it's usually a training requirement for the school. And so our office is supportive of this provision because we have spent countless hours and phone calls with parents hearing their stories of discipline being used in ways that was really inappropriate and not a good fit for helping that student make progress. And we have to tell them that, we're a law office, but there's no legal way for accountability when the protections in the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act are not being followed. I'm excited too about it because as I've seen with the special education complaint process, even though I know that that's a tool for parents to hold districts accountable, I see it really improve districts' practices over time in ways that have helped all of us together move forward and do better at implementing the laws as they are written. Thank you.
Please state your name for the record and proceed. You've got just a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to quick member questions or other testimony from the audience.
My name is Susan Montgomery. Good morning, Chair Joachim and committee members. I hope my op-ed from MinPost yesterday made your folders, offering some context on items I may not have time to address today. But for Representative Hassan's bill, House File 1761, it is important for you to hear about my son being subject to exclusionary discipline his whole educational career. And although the current school district he is in is better for him than the past 4. It has come with a cost. This fall, he was suspended again. I truly believe it was completely preventable as I had been reaching out to the school about him showing signs of needing extra support, but no one had addressed it. I was also promised by 2 staff he would benefit from their programs within the start of school, leaving no time for downfall as he would instead be encouraged, but they failed to follow through for him also. Eventually, he did something that was a bit of a cry for help, an inappropriate way of solving a problem he didn't know how to deal with. A staff member noticed my son and another student breaking a rule, and instead of that person doing a positive intervention or redirection, they waited until it was over and confiscated his backpack to be searched. Admin and police were called before parents. My son was separated into a room with people he didn't know and without an advocate or a parent present, greeted with anger from admin and forced into questioning. A child like mine is never truly able to tell their side of the story. Staff will write up a statement, and then the student is required to sign it without proper review and understanding. This often affects students of color, students who receive free and reduced lunch, and students that have disabilities. It also contributes to the school-to-prison pipeline or school push-out. The associate principal, who was assigned to my son's case, called me and demanded I come to the school to get him as soon as possible, which is not easy when you don't have transportation. She happened to be one of the same staff I reached out to several times over a month prior, as I had numerous concerns. I also wanted there to be some prevention and awareness before my son ended football. Sports help youth with their mental health and wellness. They feel like leaders when they are a part of something, and it keeps them out of trouble. But our kids are often sent home without homework, resources, or support services, nor are they allowed to appeal their dismissal. I will do anything in my power to help my son be successful at school. I have used those processes available to me to do strong advocacy, and that's why the past couple years have generally been a little bit better. But it is not easy for families, especially those of us facing disparities or barriers, leaving us no way to rectify it. The law says schools are supposed to do all things, excuse me, but there is no accountability if they don't do it. That's very dehumanizing for students and demoralizing as a parent, which makes us feel hopeless. When a staff abuses their power, violates a student, ignores abuse, or does not teach content properly, the same zero tolerance does not apply to them. I support this bill because I believe a direct complaint process with the district would give parents like me the opportunity to try to make things right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Montgomery, and I just want to thank you for your voice and your advocacy up here for your child and for being willing to share our personal story.
Thank you.
I wanted to make sure there was no other folks in the audience that wanted to quick say a word, and then we'll go to member questions at the table. I think everybody's waiting until the last bill. So great. Is there questions at the table, members? Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Montgomery. Was your child a special needs child?
Yes.
Ms.
He's
Montgomery?
also a student of color.
Oh, thank you. Thank you
Representative
for
Erickson.
clarification. Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for Representative Hassan. You know, in Section 3, you have a new definition of willful or willfully. Won't those be subjective decisions, though, for deliberate, intentional, and knowing? You know, I just have concerns. I think maybe we need to change the definition, but how do you use subjective words like this to determine whether or not it fulfills that definition?
Representative Hassan.
Madam Chair, I'm going to phone a friend.
Ms. Holder.
Madam Chair, Representative Erickson, that's a great question. And these words, willful violation, which is already in subdivision 2 in that same section, are words that courts have to make hard decisions about. And so I think that courts would have to look to those words, deliberate, intentional, and knowing, and use the same kinds of judgment tools that they use to make determinations about whether or not something was willful under the current language. That's a very good question.
Representative Erickson, a follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, teachers are going to be making these decisions, or school leaders, so that's my concern. And then, Representative Hassan, I have a question about Section 8 on page 5, which was just referred to by the testifier from legal aid. So the teacher might be here, the person about whom the complaint is brought. So how will that weigh into collective bargaining decisions that have already been made as far as corrective action for the teacher? Is there going to be an issue there? I mean, an unintended consequence. I mean, this might be, you know, a good procedure, but I think that some questions have been raised by, at least by me. And I also think that, filing the complaint with Pelsby too. I mean, where are all of these ending points going to come out as the commissioner makes this corrective directive?
Representative Hassan, or Ms. Holder?
Chair Yukim and Representative Erickson, another great question. This language is mirrored exactly upon the federal language that compels the Department of Education to have a complaint process for special education issues. And those complaints, the entity against which the complaint is filed is the district, never individual staff members who are involved in the incidents. And so in my years of handling those kinds of special education complaints, there's oftentimes you don't necessarily even name the staff involved. The district may know. The department may want to talk to individual staff members that are involved, but whether or not there's any specific repercussions or accountability for the staff members involved is really, in my understanding, up to the district. This complaint process does not involve individual staff members.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My last question. So this is mirroring federal law, but that's federal law for special education, correct?
Ms. Holder?
Chair Yukim and Representative Erickson, it's a federal requirement that our state have a complaint process in order to receive IDA funding.
Correct.
Representative Erickson.
So now this is going to fall into our regular ed policy as well.
Ms. Holder?
Chair Yukim and Representative Erickson, I think if I'm understanding the question, we have a state-level special education complaint process which we're required to have under federal law. This would create a state requirement that allows that same sort of process to exist for violations of the Pupil Fair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other member questions? Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd just like to make a couple comments if I could.
Thank you.
Listening to both of these bills, Representative Mariani's bill and now Representative Hassan, I'm sorry, Air. I have two concerns. One being the stories I'm hearing here are very concerning, and I totally acknowledge that that should not happen. The stories we heard from the young ladies, too, those disparities concern me greatly, and we need to address those and the many others that are happening in our schools. I have no doubt about that. But my second concern is the strategies I'm seeing here in these bills that are being used to address the situation. I don't believe universal one-size-fits-all works well in education. It didn't work well in my own classroom, and it didn't work well in our schools or our school districts, and it doesn't work well statewide either. When we take measures like this, where we're telling school districts and prescripting and micromanaging how they do their discipline, it's going to cause problems. And I agree with Representative Erickson that best practices need to be pushed down into our schools, but I don't believe this is the way to do it. It's teaching them, coming alongside them, and it's addressing the districts that have these huge disparity issues. Just like in my classroom, I did not do discipline procedures on my entire classroom when just a few students were acting out. And so I believe, as with our school districts, we have many school districts that have excellent discipline policies and are working well. But we have some that don't, and I acknowledge that. We need to address the ones that don't, but we should not be coming down in all school districts. We're requiring a huge amount of paperwork with many of these things. We're going to stifle innovation. What about the districts that are doing things that are really working and addressing racial disparities? But now we're saying, nope, you have to do it this way. We're also tying teachers' hands. In my classroom, I've had students throughout the years, and I taught first grade for 33 years, and mostly first grade and also special education. I had one year where I had two students that were extremely disruptive. They would get up and scream at each other. I had to have those students removed from my classroom. But with things like this, my hands would be tied. What about the other students that I need to be working with? There's times when you need to remove a student from a classroom to de-escalate the situation. They feed off each other. They feed off the students who are reacting to them. And they need to be able to go to a quiet spot in an appropriate way to be de-escalated. please don't tie teachers' hands or schools' hands with this universal one-size-fits-all way to address it. We need to address it on a more individual basis, send best practices to districts, educate districts, just like I would with my students. So that's a plea.
Thank you, Representative Bennett. Representative Hassan. Follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is not an attack on teachers and school administrators. This is rather trying to help change a system that left Black, brown, and indigenous kids behind, and kids who are struggling with disability. So I don't want people here thinking that, oh yeah, because there's few bad apples, we're going to throw away the whole bag. That's not what it is. It's not only few schools that are doing this. It's a statewide issue. There are some exceptional schools that are doing great, and we thank them for their work. But if so many of our students are left behind, then it has to be a problem that's bigger than one school or two schools or schools in the metro or specific group of schools. No, this is a problem statewide. Minnesota is the best in the nation for white students and 44th place for disparities for Black, brown, and indigenous students. So this is not a problem that's specific to one area or one specific schools. This is a rather systemic problem that it was created, the system was created. People say the system is broken. The system is doing what it was meant to do. It was created for white students, and it's educating white students and leaving everyone else behind. And we cannot and should not sit behind and say that, oh, there is one problem. It's an isolated incident. It's not.
Thank you, Representative Hassan. Representative Mariani, and then we're going to move on to the next bill.
Madam Chair, really quickly, and I know my bill better than I do Representative Hassan's, but strong similarities. And it seems to me that requiring due process, tracking information, sharing practices, being inclusive before being exclusive are hardly dictating to school districts and local control how to do things. It's about setting up our expectations of what our citizens ought to expect in our public schools. You know, in my bill, there's a section that we're looking to strike, and to my dear colleague who just raised the question, you probably would want to join me then in striking this language. In that, on page 17 of my bill, it talks about a classroom teacher has a legitimate educational interest in knowing which students placed in the teacher's classroom have a history of violent behavior. That's currently in statute. It sure sounds like we're dictating to school districts and to schools, you know, what kind of information we should be requiring for our classroom teachers. And so, you know, we can pick and choose, you know, what is a mandate and what's not a mandate here, you know, but we should be at least honest and consistent about whether or not we are expecting certain things of our schools and why we're expecting them. And it seems to me, again, this goes to the issue of bias. You know, it's okay to tell schools to do certain things, but it's not okay to tell schools to do other things if it means equity and equal justice for our students of color.
Thank you, Representative Mariani. Representative Scott, one more quick word, and then we're going to give Representative Hassan the closing statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And there's just so much I want to say, and I'm not going to say it all here, but how are we going, if these policies are adopted, how are we going to measure the success of these policies? If we adopt these sorts of policies and it doesn't affect the achievement gap, then where do we go from here? If Representative Hassan might want to take a stab at that, because I get frustrated sitting here thinking that this is going to be, and I know maybe I'm overgeneralizing here, but thinking that this is going to be the be-all, end-all in solving our achievement problem, when the Democrats traditionally have stood in the way of children that are, and parents that have children in failing schools from getting enabling those children to be going to a different school, holding teachers accountable that aren't effective teachers in the classroom. And I see this, I think we probably agree on this, I think this is the civil rights issue of our day, that this huge disparity in education between students of color and white children. And it bothers me greatly that this exists, but I'm not sure that this is the be-all, end-all answer. And what are we doing at the same time? Because outside of the parent's influence on a child, that classroom teacher is the number one effector of whether that child succeeds in the classroom or not. And so if we have an ineffective teacher, but they're protected by the teachers union, what are we really doing to address this problem if we're not going to get rid of the ineffective teacher?
Representative Hassan.
So research shows that out-of-class suspensions are a big part of the disparity, the education disparity that we have. 50,000 suspensions and expulsions each year. So we're not sitting here saying that we have the solution to solve this education disparity. We are saying that this is something possibly that contribute to solve the problem. It's not the whole pie. It's maybe one small portion of the pie. And we're trying to do everything possible to say, let's try everything possible to combat this issue, because doing nothing has not worked for us.
Representative Scott.
Thank you. Well, if this is one piece of the pie and you want to do everything, then what are you proposing this year to get rid of ineffective teachers in the classroom?
Representative Hassan, I think we're starting to go far afield, but
No, Madam Chair, I don't think that we
Representative
are.
Scott, you will not talk over me today. I have not had enough coffee for that. So, Representative Hassan.
I believe, Madam Chair and Representative Scott, I believe there are enough bills that are moving through this body that's addressing the education disparity. We have looking at the tier license, teacher tier license. We're looking at increasing, teacher of color and indigenous teachers. We're looking at expulsion and suspensions. We're working hard to have a conversation that's uncomfortable for many people, because people don't want to talk about disparities. We want to talk about we're one Minnesota great, we all love each other, this is Minnesota nice. But Minnesota nice has a hole in it, and that hole is causing our kids to fail in system that was never created for them. So we are doing everything we can. Maybe you should join us and stand with us about these disparities.
Representative Scott, first I want to apologize. I should have not raised my voice. Did you have a follow-up?
Madam Chair, I'll believe that you really are serious about this when you do something to not back a teacher that's ineffective. When you show me that you are willing to do something about the ineffective teacher in the classroom that's causing a child in that classroom of color, or any child, to not get a good education, then I'll join your team.
Thank you, Representative Scott. Representative Hassan, did you have any closing comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative Scott, if you write that bill, I'll support it. So, members, Madam Chair and members, I just want to say that our education system is bleeding. Our kids are crying for help, and we need to do everything absolutely possible to help those kids, to make sure that this is not a people of color problem, it's Minnesota problem, it's workforce issue. If we're not educating 30% of the students that we're supposed to be educating, we're gonna have serious workforce issues. These kids are not going to graduate from high school, graduate from college, they will not join the workforce. And if they decide to, because society didn't give them enough chances to be successful, if they end up in the school to prison pipeline, we will be supporting, and they will be a burden to society instead of becoming productive members of society. And I think every one of us cares about that, making sure that our next generation are all productive members of society. And if we are serious about this conversation, let's start doing something about this education disparity. This is a start, but there's more to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Hassan. And members, like I said, I apologize for raising my temper. I know this is a very emotional issue. We're going to go on to one more bill, and then we're going to open it up for testimony. I just want to remind folks to please be respectful with your questions and comments. That's for all of us to hear. And we will get through this today. And sometimes having disruptive conversations is difficult, but we need to do that. if we're going to move Minnesota forward. And I think we laid out a good agenda to tackle the opportunity gap, little bits at a time, because if we all know, we've been around here long enough to know that there's not one silver bullet. If there was one, I think we would have found it long ago.
Yeah.
So we need to put as much on the table as we can, and that's what today is about. And I also wanted to clear up, too, there was reference to Rule 6.20 when it comes to meeting afternoon. It says right here that during the first 10 weeks of session in the odd number year and the first 5 weeks of session in the even number year, because we can never make anything easy, a standing committee must not have a regular scheduled meeting afternoon on Friday, but the speaker may approve a special meeting of a committee during this time. The speaker has approved it. She approved it last week. It has been noticed quite frequently about that we were going to go past noon. So there is no direction in the rules book about how that has to be delivered, but we have been very open and honest with all the testifiers, all the authors, and the committee members as we've posted this hearing. So, Representative Herr, would you like to move your bill before the committee? We have House File 3396, and the intention of the chair is to have it moved towards the General Register. Would you like to make that motion?
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd like to move House File 3396 to be placed in the General Registry.
Thank you, Representative Herr. We have House File 3396 before us. I understand that you have just a few testifiers here today to explain the bill with you, and then we are going to open it up and have 30 minutes testifying in support and at least 30 minutes for concerns, and then maybe if we have a little bit of time before our quick break now, since we're going over already, we may see if there's anybody else in the audience that has something to add. So Representative Herr, would you like to describe your bill?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I wish we would have taken the break before because I do have to go to the bathroom. But I've been holding it in because this discussion is really important.
If it's an emergency, let me know and we can take it.
I really appreciate the discussion today, Madam Chair and members. I know that the conversation has been intense at some times, but I truly believe that our hearts are in the right place. But I think at the end of the day, we all love children equally, and we all want to do the right things by our kids. I had this whole speech prepared today for my opening, and I don't know, I mean, a lot of what was already said was said by Representative Mariani and Representative Hassan, and I just wanted to say a couple of really quick words that I appreciate Representative Mariani setting the tone for what this conversation would be like today. You are much more balanced than I might be, and I really appreciate that. And I want to acknowledge Representative Erickson's suggestion that guidance should be provided by the commissioner and best practices. And really what I believe is that this bill, House File 3396, is that guidance. I applaud our commissioner for her leadership in this work. And this guidance is needed. And if you look through this bill, and I know that there are actually a couple of things that were brought to my attention this morning that a number of advocate groups have been working on with MDE or with the commissioner, or past commissioners, I think that was, on some of the language that was omitted from this on accident. So we'll continue to work with the groups on making sure that what was intended for the condition of this bill for it to be in the right place right now will actually be as it moves through this process. But I just want to thank the commissioner for her work on this. This guidance is really important. And as you look at this, what this bill does is set common grounds for terms and understanding. That it's really going through and defining what terms might mean, what processes would look like, and how next steps and codifying those processes into law to help us with doing right by all of our students. This process is needed because evidence shows us that suspensions are helping to drive the achievement gap between white and minority students. Suspensions and expulsions are also linked to the disproportionate number of minority students in the criminal justice system. Nationally, black students are suspended 3 times as often as their white peers, and in Minnesota, it's 8 times as often. In a 2018 study, Minnesota Department of Human Rights notified 43 school districts and charter schools that suspension rates for nonviolent offenses still suggest widespread discriminatory practices. And I think that everybody's experience is so different within this process, and that we all could tell a million story which contradicts each other's story. And the point isn't to say, well, why is my story more important than your story? The point is to understand that all of these stories do exist. And what I want to point out, because people always say, well, you have to hear both sides of the story. And this is the narrative that shapes people of color's thinking, people of color and indigenous people's thinking, is that we're always taught to question our experiences and to see if they are actually valid before we take action. And what I want to explain is that this is about same consequences for same actions. And I want to just bring up one example, and I'm not going to name the school district or the school in which this happened in, but a federal investigator found that not long ago, a black second grade student was suspended for 1 day for poking another student with a pencil. But a white second grader who threw a rock that hit another student and broke a teacher's sunglasses was not. That the white student was allowed to work off the cost of the sunglasses by helping the teacher at lunch for several days. These are the things that we're talking about, not talking about bad teachers doing bad things every day or bad school districts not caring about children of color. It is about what happens within the classroom that people are interpreting and deciding for themselves. And what we need to do is give clarification so that well-meaning teachers are given the guidance they need in order to have the tools that they need to do their work and to teach all of our students. And so the objective of this bill is not to undermine teachers. It is not to undermine the profession. It is to give them the tools that they need to address the issues they are experiencing in their classrooms. And with that, I would like to just turn it over to my testifiers so that they can provide more details around the specifics of the bill itself.
Thank you, Representative. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Mary Kay Kanega-Litzo, and I'm the Director of Compliance and Assistance at the Minnesota Department of Education. I'm going to walk through the non-exclusionary practices language that is in Bill 3396. Before I do that, I just wanted to preface that the Minnesota Department of Education has provided districts with the schools with the opportunity to participate in cohorts for positive, evidence-based positive supports interventions that assist school-wide basis. We've been doing that for over 10 years, and this is just a continuation of that work in focusing on positive-based strategies. Section 1 of the bill amends Minnesota Statute 120A.22 Subdivision 7. It adds the language pupil withdrawal agreements, which is defined for, later in the statute. The language right now is that if a student is expelled or excluded from school, that information is transmitted in the educational records if the student moves to a different district. This just includes pupil withdrawal agreements as well in that, because those are used to avoid an expulsion or exclusion. These changes it also includes that the record must document any service a pupil requires to prevent inappropriate behavior from recurring. These changes will provide the new district with information to help ensure that the pupil continues to receive the services required so that they can be successful and engaged in school. Section 2, 3, and 4 amend the definition section of Minnesota Statute, Section 121A41. Section 2 of the bill amends Subdivision 7, which is adding a definition of in-school suspension and direct supervision. The in-school suspension definition is consistent with the civil rights data collection definition, and districts are already collecting that data and submitting that to the Office of Civil Rights. It will also enable us to be able to have a more complete picture of in-school suspension data, as historically we have only collected that data for students receiving special education services. The definition of out-of-school suspension for more than one school day has been revised to one school day. Schools have struggled with understanding when to report an out-of-school suspension to MDE through the electronic discipline incident reporting system. I had dealt with that years back, and that continues to be a question that arises. Some school districts are reporting a suspension of 1 day, which is consistent with their school district discipline policy. The new definition provides more consistency across districts and will give us a better picture of the amount of time students are dismissed from school. Section 3 of the bill adds a new definition, non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices, alternatives to pupil removal and dismissal. It is replacing the language alternative educational services. And I wanted to state that in the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act, it uses alternative educational services in two places, one prior to dismissal and one for the services to be provided after. The definition of alternative educational services in the statute really is referencing the services that you receive once you have been dismissed. The language in the non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices address those items that a school would be using prior to a student reaching the point where a dismissal is necessary. The list is non-exhaustive. Many of the items are things that school districts are already doing. Again, it is setting that framework, an array of services that are available, focusing on positive interventions. It includes social and emotional learning, counseling, social work services, school-linked mental health services, referrals as appropriate for special ed or 504 evaluations, academic screening for Title I, and reading interventions. It also incorporates in the definition policies and practices that are found in other statutes. Again, these are things that school districts already have in place, and it's just focusing on that these are the items to be provided to students prior to them reaching the point where we need to do a dismissal, focusing on intervening and redirecting and supporting a student's behavior. Section 4 of the bill amends by adding the definition of pupil withdrawal agreement. It defines the process in which school districts and parent guardians agree to withdraw a student from school to avoid an expulsion or exclusion. That's often referred to as well as a contract in lieu of exclusion. It defines it as a verbal or written agreement between a school or district administrator and a pupil's parent or guardian to withdraw the student from school to avoid expulsion or exclusion dismissal proceedings. Our expulsion numbers have been going down for some time, but we have not been collecting that data on students who have been withdrawn by signing these types of agreements. By adding this provision, we are ensuring that those students receive alternative educational services because that is not consistent across school districts that use these agreements, and also to make sure that we have a full picture of the amount of students who are being dismissed from school. Section 5 of the bill amends Minnesota Statute 121A45 Subdivision 1 to again insert non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practice in place of the current language, provide alternative educational services. In addition, it adds pupil withdrawal proceedings. This better describes the practices to be used before an exclusionary dismissal, as alternative educational services again describe what happens after a student has been dismissed. There continues to be the exception that has always existed in this statute, where if there is a student, it appears the pupil will create an immediate and substantial danger to self or surrounding persons or property, then the school district does not have to use the non-disclusionary policies and practices prior to that dismissal. Section 6 of the bill amends Minnesota Statute 121A46 Subdivision 4 to add language that a school administrator must ensure that alternative educational services are provided when a pupil is suspended from school for more than 5 school days. This is really a technical change, as that language has historically been part of the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act. When Minnesota Statute Section 121A43 was added, the language was moved to that statute, which is focused on discipline of students receiving special education services. So by inserting this language, it just recognizes that applies to all students. Section 7 amends Minnesota Statute Section 121A46 by adding Subdivision 5, which is a definition of minimum education services. Students who are suspended must have the opportunity to complete all work assigned during their absence, and if any modifications need to be made to those assignments, that it addresses the same standards and has the same amount of assigned credit. It also encourages school administrators to designate a district or school employee to work as a liaison between the school and their teacher to timely communicate and transmit assignments and receive teacher feedback. Section 8 amends Minnesota Statute 121A47 Subdivision 2, which is the written notice that a district provides when they are proceeding with a expulsion or expulsion. In place of alternative educational services, the language non-exclusionary practices is inserted, and the word shall is replaced with must, and that happens throughout in the statute. And also so it's the district must inform the parents in the notice that there is a list of free or low-cost legal assistance resource list, and that is available on the department's website. Section 9 amends Minnesota Statute 121A53 Subdivision 1, which adds pupil withdrawals as defined in the statute as one of the required reporting elements through DIRS, which is the Discipline Incident Reporting System, that must occur within 30 days of the effective date of the action or agreement. Under reporting requirements, non-exclusionary disciplinary practices is inserted in place of alternative educational services. Section 10 of the bill amends 121A55, which addresses school board disciplinary policies. The first change, again, is technical in replacing the word shall with must throughout, and it states must include non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices consistent with the statutory definition, and must be designed to address students' inappropriate behavior from recurring. And I want to I want to state that the part about designed to address students' inappropriate behaviors from recurring already exists in the statute. The school is responsible for ensuring that the alternative educational services provided to the pupil must be adequate to allow progress to meet graduation standards to help prepare for readmission. This is not new. We are just, again, focusing to make sure that those services, the student is able to retain the standards and be readmitted and be able to graduate on time. Paren D is new language that applies when a district expels, excludes, or enters into a pupil agreement as previously defined. This section includes that school districts are responsible to review the pupil's work on a quarterly basis to ensure the student is making progress toward readmission. During these longer expulsion, exclusion, or pupil withdrawal agreement can be up to 12 months. It's also required that there is regular communication between the school district and the parent guardian to ensure that pupils are completing the work assigned, and that this obligation ends if a student enrolls and is admitted into another school district during that dismissal period. If school-based mental health services are provided in a district as defined in the Mental Health Grant Statute, the pupil remains eligible for those services until enrolled in another district. And finally, that the district provides a list of mental health counseling services available to the pupil after dismissal, and that list be posted on the district or charter school's website.
Thank you. Mr. Cordy, if you can make it brief, that would be great.
I will, absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair, members. My name is Darren Cordy. I'm an Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Student Health and Wellbeing at the Minnesota Department of Education. Just wanted to call a few things. First of all, I wanted to thank Representative Herr for carrying this bill and the chair and the committee for spending so much time on this important issue. We've been talking about a lot of statistics, and one of the statistics that I wanted to point out that I don't think has been called out yet, that in the 17-18 school year, as a result of out-of-school suspensions, Minnesota students missed 107,500 days of school. And I mean, to me, that's a shocking number. And we've already talked about the existing disparities in those numbers, how students with disabilities and students of color are overrepresented in those numbers. And so I just wanted to point out, these are the same students that we are constantly talking about how we're struggling to close the achievement gap with. So I feel like through this legislation, if we can just even reduce the amount of days that we're talking about, these 100,000 days of school that kids are missing, if we could just reduce that by a fraction, I feel like we can make some real progress on closing the achievement gap. Wanted to also talk a little bit about, the behavior we're talking about here. There was already a lengthy discussion about subjective behaviors and how we might look at some behaviors as one person might look at something as disruptive, whereas another person may not. I just wanted to point out that about a third of all the disciplinary actions that took place in the state in 17 and 18 were done as a result of what was considered to be disruptive, disorderly, or insubordinate behavior. So it's not a small amount of the total expulsions and suspensions we're talking about here. It's a lot. So I feel like if we can really focus on those, and, what we're requiring in this bill is definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. All it's asking is that a district do something before it dismisses a child through suspension or expulsion. And we lay out a number of options in the bill. There's actually 8 that are listed out there as evidence-based options, but it also says including but not limited to. So districts are free to use any other option that they see fit as long as it has an evidence basis that they can show behind it. And the last thing I wanted to point out about removing children from class is that there is a statute that already is on point on that. It's 121A.61. Requires districts to have a policy for removing students' discipline and removal of class students from class. We don't touch that statute at all in here. That remains entirely intact, and a good chunk of that statute talks about what the teacher's authority is and is not. So we're not messing with that at all. I'm sorry, one last point, Madam Chair, there was some discussion around guidance, and yes, we do provide guidance to districts. We do provide training. In fact, we just hired a new full-time staff member that's dedicated exclusively to school discipline issues. But the problem is that guidance and training does not carry the force of law. And we need your help to help us ensure that districts are actually hearing this guidance and following this guidance and taking the trainings. So really, as Representative Hurst said, the things that we recommend in here are the things that we do provide guidance on, the things we do provide training on. We just need your help in making sure that districts are following that.
Thank you. Members, we're going to have all the testimony first, and then just want to make sure, though, that Mr. Corti, Ms. Litzau, you'll be around to answer questions. Okay, because I don't want, Mr.
Madam
Corti?
Chair, I actually do need to get over to the governor's office for a meeting that I'm already a little late for, so if there were maybe a couple.
Did anybody have a specific question for Mr. Corti? Representative Scott.
I think this is for him. Thank you, Madam Chair. And so the teachers that have contacted me concerned about their lack of control in the classroom and the ability to control the classroom, I guess, because what they've described to me is a child that is having kind of a meltdown. Everybody else has to leave the classroom. They are not even allowed to touch that child and escort them down to the principal's office. Could you clarify for me, is statute murky in that area as far as can a teacher gently take the child by the arm down to the principal's office to, if you could address that question for me, please. Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Corti.
Madam Chair, Representative Scott, thank you for the question. There is a statute that governs removal from class. Again, as I mentioned, it's not addressed in this bill, but it is a local policy that is required to be developed at the district level, and there's a number of things that need to be a part of that policy, but ultimately I think the level of detail that you're talking about is something that would be locally determined in that district policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Representative Erickson, quickly, just to Mr. Corti, he has to leave.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Corti. Nice to see you again. I think we worked on this previously when I was the chair of this committee, but I have a question about, and maybe this is for Ms. Litzau. In Section 3, Subdivision 12, the teacher will have to exhaust all options, is that correct, before removing the student?
Mr. Corti?
Madam Chair, Representative Erickson, there is a provision in there that talks about using non-exclusionary policies before removal from class. I think that may have been a relic of a previous version of a bill, and I'm not sure that that was necessarily our intent. I know our main intent was that before you actually begin dismissal proceedings, that is moving toward suspension, expulsion, pupil withdrawal, that you use these practices. So I think we're open to discussion with the committee and the author if there's some comfort language that we need there.
Great.
Madam Chair.
Representative Erickson?
So are you, Mr. Corti, is the department going to bring forth the amendments that we're not hearing today, which we should have been hearing in committee for Representative Hurst's bill? Or what's the process that's going to occur? Because this is going to happen on the floor if this goes to the general register. And that's an inappropriate way to discuss these issues where we are the policy committee. Mr. Corti?
Representative Erickson, we had this bill posted long enough for people to apply amendments. Nobody submitted any, but I think what I'm hearing from the testifier saying and from Representative Hur, that they're both more than willing to entertain amendments and talk about it. This is the way we do the process. So Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Commissioner Corti. Just quickly, I'm trying to find out just what some non-exclusionary practices are. Now, in looking at the bill, it says must include non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices consistent with Section 121A41, subdivision 12. I have 121A41 before me, but it only has 11 subdivisions. I'm sure the other one's here somewhere, but, and I'm assuming that alternative education services, that they would be non-exclusionary, but can you provide me with some examples or tell me where to find the others?
Mr. Cordy.
Yes, Madam Chair, Representative Erdahl, if you look on line 3.8 of the bill, House File 3396, you'll see that's where we add that subdivision 12. And in subdivision 12, that provides your definition of non-exclusionary disciplinary policies. On line 3.11, it lists some examples there. Again, I think there are 8 examples that we list, and one is alternative education services. But we do have that including but not limited to language in there as well, which gives districts some flexibility if those 8 don't quite work for them.
All right, thank you, that's
Representative
helpful.
Erdahl. Representative Erdahl, I've done that same thing before, so don't feel bad. And I'm glad you got the books. I always do that too. Mr. Cordy, I had a quick question too. I was distracted and didn't hear the beginning of the testimony. Did you say that that you had some amendments that you didn't get to us, or I was misunderstanding?
Madam Chair, I think that there was maybe some pieces that when this got moved from the language from last year into the current bill and then into this bill, there may have been some pieces that got missed or changed. So I think that was what the amendment was that we were talking about, but I'm sorry that we don't have that in front of you today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cordy. I did not hear that. And I know that many of our bills move to the floor until we get peace in the valley, and I feel comfortable that we could do this on the floor if we got all parties to agree. So, Representative Grunehagen.
Oh, well, I can wait to.
Can you wait? Okay,
Yeah,
great,
okay.
thank you. I think what we're going to do, members, is to have that half an hour of supporters come up, and then I want to give that half an hour to folks that had concerns, and maybe even a little bit longer for them. And then we will take a break, unless I'm seeing folks that need a break right now. Are we okay? We're going to plow through. All right, so as testifiers come up that are listed, please state your name for the record. Please keep your comments brief. We will be timing. You get 30 minutes. So that would be wonderful. And Representative Herr, if you can direct traffic, do you have the list? Or should I direct traffic? Okay, I'll do it then. We first have Janelle Ellis, and then Erica Vallant, Libby Guntner, and then Dr. Justin Killian, Adele Abdul, Mayo Tao, and Matthew Shaver. So members, like I said, those going first, please be succinct so that the rest of your folks can actually have their voices heard as well. So Janelle Ellis first, state your name for the record and proceed.
Hello, Chair and committee members. My name is Janelle Ellis, and I am the mother of 3 smart, caring, and ambitious boys, ages 10, 15, and 17 years old. I live in Brooklyn Center, and my children have attended Birch Grove Elementary, Monroe Elementary, Brooklyn Middle, Park Center High School, and others. I've also been an educator in St. Paul School District, Anoka Hennepin School District, and currently I am the Restorative Justice Youth Program Manager at a local nonprofit. I'm here today after taking off work and dropping my children off at school because what I want to share with you is that important. Over the years, I have seen the best and some of the most challenging interactions with my children at their schools, and today I want to share with you the challenge I have faced personally with my children once they've been suspended or dismissed. When my children have been suspended, I've had to stay home, miss work. Each of those times, there was never a reentry process to clarify, reflect on the situation, restore harm, and essentially nothing was said. Everyone was just supposed to go back to normal. The schools have never had a formal reentry process for my children and myself. So beyond the conversations that I have had with my sons about lessons and understanding about the situation, there's still a lot of unclarity. Many times I have felt that the early dismissals and suspensions were not based on policy or practice, but rather the teacher needed better skills or they were overwhelmed, not just by my son, but by the class overall. When I asked what strategies were in place for the goal of keeping them in the classroom before he would be removed from class, the response was always, once he was removed, he can and settle him down, he can come back into the class, and that was it. Repeat. Expecting him to be ready to be successful, never giving thoughtful thoughts about strategies to improve behavior or communication about expectations after. There was no guidance, there was no structure. They just kept sending him out. It wasn't, we tried X, Y, Z before sending him out. I kept asking, what are we doing to make sure he stays in the classroom? How can I partner with you to keep him in the classroom? That was for me personally. Professionally, I have seen many examples of students and parents that have been referred to me that believe they should have never been there in the first place. It demonstrates glaring issues on how schools are not navigating, not abiding by policies, and not seeking common sense solutions. For example, a Twin Cities school suspended a student for stealing juice from the cafeteria. Now, I understand that stealing is wrong and there should be consequences. But in this instance, and in many instances, the school overreacted. They suspended, ticketed the student, sent him to the JDC. The parent was only notified from the JDC to come pick up their child. They were not notified about the incident from school. There were many alternatives available to the school, but the school resorted to an overly punitive approach to discipline. Another example I am thinking of is a student who is on an IEP. The IEP states that it provides a bus para. This day, there was no bus para available, and the student went on the bus alone or without one. An incident occurred. The student was ticketed. I felt like the school did not abide by the IEP, and yet she was the one punished, and there was no recourse. A system was set in place. The school failed to follow procedure, and when something happened, the student in the end was the one who paid for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next testifier is Erica Vallant. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Erica Valiant, and I am here to talk about what I'm going through and advocating for my niece, who is an 8th grader at a St. Paul Middle School. And first of all, I'm going to start with the fact that she's been suspended multiple times throughout the year, more than 5 times, for multiple reasons. And on top of that, there were many times where she was sent home early, and where they called me too to pick her up, and they would say, hey, you know, you need to come pick Malay up. She needs a break. Bring her back Monday. And it's maybe Wednesday. And I just found out that they count those as excused absences. So there's that. Now, right now she's been having issues with another student. She was involved in a fight. The students were fine after. However, the school called, I guess, the resource officer and an emergency services team that they have, which is their protocol. But on top of that, the student's mother pressed charges. And so we had to go to court. At court, now, and she hasn't had any legal issues at all, right? So, and they want to charge her with assault. And they also issued her a no contact order for physical contact, which is fine, but also verbal contact, which is really difficult for an 8th grade student who's been having issues with this girl who she actually knew since 4th grade. And they're friends again, and then they're not friends, and then they're friends, they're not friends, and they switch best friends, and all these things. So, you know, and, you know, aside from that, too, she's also been having just a lot of problems. And the school has been doing something, not enough, so I'm not going to act like the school has been ignoring it. However, after the no contact order was issued, and I did talk to the school about it, and I gave them a copy of it, that other student's mother came in with her, and my niece was in the office, and the mother started to kind of banter with my niece. And she threatened her. And the staff didn't do anything. They kind of just stood there. And, you know, my niece was asking to call her mom, and multiple times she has to call her mom, and they won't let her call her mom. They told her to just go to class. And she was so upset because they didn't protect her. She went to the behavior specialist's office, and when she called me, she was with the security guard. I called the school, my sister called the school. We talked to the principal, and it was just, you know, a lot to get around. Before all this happened, well, actually, before the fight, the day before the fight, my niece told me that, she said, I told the staff that I was going to end up fighting her because she won't leave me alone. I said, well, what did they say? She said, they didn't say anything. They said, all they said was, don't do it. Okay, well, she asked for help, and they kind of ignored it. If a 14-year-old is saying, I feel like, I'm going to explode, like, this is getting to be too much for me, in so many words, and you don't do anything, and then when something happens, she's suspended, and by the way, the other girl was not suspended, then that's a problem to me. So we had so many issues that I had to write a letter to the school board just to get a deeper conversation going. Because, again, I had been in contact with the school during the whole time, but things just were not happening the right way. At the meeting with our assistant superintendent and the principal and the ombudsman, we talked about, number one, why the staff did not protect her at that time. Number two, how are they supposed to react in a situation like that, especially given the fact that there's no contact order, and these are middle school kids. Number three, she did let you know that she was having a problem and you kind of ignored her. Number four, she was kind of attacked and she was not protected. She wasn't even allowed to call her mom. And then we also talked about, with all these suspensions and all the times that she was sent home, how do you expect her to learn something? My question has always been to principals when I talk to them about suspension is, we get all these as parents, because I also have 3 children in the public school system, and I have 6 nephews and 2 nieces in the public school system right now in St. Paul. And I always ask them, so you tell us that you've got all these stats around how detrimental it is for students to miss so many days of school, right? All of these statistics, but how is it different when the school is causing them to miss this much time? The school doesn't get contacted by a truancy officer. They don't have any consequences for the education that this child is missing. What the parents do. So, what's the difference? Nobody can answer. Nobody has ever been able to answer me. How is it different when the school is causing a child to miss this much class time?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Fallon. I want to keep it moving so that we can have some of the other testifiers. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Libby Guntner, and then Dr. Justin Killian. If you could state your name for the record and proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Libby Gunter, and I'm here as a parent advocate. The day I realized school wasn't always a safe place for a child was November 7th, 2017. That was the first day I was called to pick up my son Michael from school because he was required to leave for the day. He was 4 years old at the time, attending pre-K in a public school system. When I arrived to the school to collect Michael, he was covered in paint from head to toe, and the classroom he was in was closed for the day for cleaning. I couldn't understand how a child at 4 years old could get so messy so quickly. If he was being actively engaged with the teaching staff, how would it be possible for someone so small to destroy a classroom and all of his clothes? What I discovered is that Michael was left alone in the classroom because he was being difficult to manage. He was locked in a classroom unsupervised, and in that process, he found the paint and trashed the place. 2 members of the school district staff would eventually tell me the full story, asking for their names to be kept in confidence, though administrators denied that this ever happened. After the paint incident, we went through an official process to have Michael assessed for an IEP, or an individualized education plan. We had asked for this during Michael's kindergarten screening process, but the school said he passed just enough to not have any red flags or need special accommodations. Of course, we saw red flags with Michael's speech issues, his inability to process, high stimulation environments, and the results through that IEP process is that Michael would have a paraprofessional part-time to help guide him and redirect him through the day. This happened late in the pre-K year, therefore we had to wait until kindergarten in the real classroom environment to see how this would go. So once kindergarten rolled around, it took about a week for me to get an email from his teacher telling me he was misbehaving in class and that he was missing classroom time because he had to be removed constantly. The behaviors were mainly surrounding difficulty transitioning from task to task and not listening. With each passing week of the 2018-2019 school year, I could see Michael's spunky personality fading a little, especially when I asked him about school. I figured it was the same thing we experienced with my daughter, who is 2 years older than Michael, so I just shook it off. But that's until the phone calls started happening from the school, which is about week 3. I received phone calls almost daily to tell me that Michael was misbehaving at school. There were well over 20 days in his kindergarten year that I was called and asked him to pick up from school early because he couldn't be handled. Sometimes it was in the afternoon, but other days I might have just gotten in an hour or two at my office when the call would come in. I dreaded seeing the school's number on my caller ID because I knew I would have to leave work early, drive 45 minutes across town to pick up my guy, who would be 100% happy and himself when I got there. It really made no sense. When I received those calls, they would say Michael was running away or misbehaving, having a tantrum. He wouldn't settle down. But again, when I was there, he was happy and just like any other child at school. I only found out through IEP meetings that the school district was removing Michael from his class so often, and sometimes the whole day, also using restraints on him as a kindergartner. This, of course, only made him act out even more. He was terrified of the staff members he interacted with daily. I still remember the day this was disclosed in his IEP meeting, but I was never informed that the restraints had occurred so many times prior. Thinking about grown adults restraining my child over things that were truly beyond his control makes me sick to my stomach. It's gut-wrenching to relive it. The tipping point in Michael's story comes when the principal of Michael's school called me to tell me he ran away from his para and crossed a fence at the school playground onto other property. When I knew Michael was safe, I asked a lot of questions about this, and it seemed like he was being treated kind of like a wild animal, where they were chasing him around and trying to corner him. After his escape, the school told me they were going to call the police on him if I didn't come and pick him up from school immediately. I stopped dead in my tracks outside of the conference room at work that I was pacing around, and I thought, really? Call the police on a 6-year-old? Apparently, after this incident, he was restrained, and he was hitting, crying, and hysterical. I suppose I would be too if I was being treated like this. He wasn't learning anything in school, and he really just hated being there. The reason the police call incident is important is because I really just started feeling defeated and started talking with my friends about this experience. One of my friends told me about the Pacer Center and the involvement that they had really made all the difference in establishing a plan for Michael and to see the success that we've seen with him now. Michael had a schedule with breaks when needed to smooth over his transitions from activity to activity. He had a plan to stay engaged in the classroom with activities with his classmates. And we were able to get the school to complete a more comprehensive IEP assessment, which then concluded that Michael wasn't just misbehaving by choice, but that he was on the autism spectrum. Once they determined he had a true disability and I had the backing of the Pacer Center, Michael was kept in the classroom for the majority of his days. He was being included like other children in all of the activities. Michael's inclusion in activities boosted his confidence and ultimately has allowed him to be hugely successful this year as a first grader. Michael loves working on math sheets, telling me about what he learned in the day, and he adores his teacher. He's been able to build his trust back up with his school as a result of being part of his classroom community. I really don't know where we'd be today without the advocacy of this Pacer Center. I really get teary-eyed thinking about it.
Thank you, Ms. Guntner. Thank you. Dr. Killian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank Representative Herr for bringing this very brave bill forward. This is a really difficult topic, as we've seen, and I've been listening to the conversations that have been happening today. I think the 3 young ladies from St. Louis Park High School were tremendous testifiers and did a fantastic job that gave us living proof that this problem is real. I also want to thank Representative Bennett for something she said, and unfortunately I saw that she stepped out. But during questioning on the other bills, she said, I want to point out that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. I couldn't agree more with Representative Bennett, and unfortunately, that's what we have right now, right? We have a one-size-fits-all, and we have 4 decades of research to show us that suspensions and expulsions do not make our schools safer, do not close achievement gaps, do not improve academic performance. The Department of Education hit many of the statistics that I was going to go over today, so for sake of time, I'm not going to hit those. I would like to say that a lot of the confusion I think that's happening, Madam Chair, is over what non-exclusionary means. this is not the time to really get into all the different ways that you can do a non-exclusionary intervention, but I think that that would be an excellent like brown bag lunch or something. And I know a host of experts that would be willing to give up their time for free to explain what those are. In Minnesota, American Indian students are 10 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. African American students, it's 8 times more likely, and students with disabilities are twice more likely. The disparities also exist for Latinx students, English learners, and our LGBTQ+ students. Implicit bias is real. Implicit bias has caused this problem, as has systemic racism. But you don't have to take my word for it. The Department of Education, under the direction of Secretary Betsy DeVos, appointed by President Donald Trump, in 2018 released a report on the task force on reversing the school to prison pipeline. And I'm going to quote the department and the secretary now. Discipline and other disparities are based on race and cannot be explained by more frequent or serious misbehavior by minority students. As the department recently stated, quite emphatically and unambiguously, in our investigations, we have found cases where African American students were disciplined more harshly and more frequently because of their race than similarly situated white students. In short, racial discrimination in school discipline is a real problem. Substantial empirical research corroborates the U.S. Department of Education's conclusion. The moment for pointing blame is over, right? We've all created this system that's led to this, and this House file is a step in the direction of creating an anti-racist paradigm shift that the Minnesota schools need. We applaud Section 3, Subdivision 12, which provides an excellent definition of what a non-exclusionary practice is, but that means that this body is eventually going to have to fund those practices in our schools. Section 5 requires districts to start with non-exclusionary interventions. We also praise that, but again, that's going to require full-time employees, and it's going to require more funding, and it's going to require training for all educators, teachers, administrators, custodians, lunchroom workers, bus drivers, everyone. Section 10 gives suspended students the right to make up missed academic opportunities, requires readmission plans, and protects suspended rights to counseling services. These are all great first steps. Also, other bills that are moving through this committee and through this body call for a moratorium on suspending 4-year-olds, and we couldn't be more supportive of that move. It is time to quit suspending our babies for playing with chapstick. Now, I've said a lot, and I'm a researcher, so I'm going to end with the words of Amber Surfling. She's an elementary school teacher and a special education teacher in Grand Rapids. She's with her students today, so she couldn't be with us, but she's taught me a lot about this topic. I had the pleasure of visiting her classroom and learning so much from her. And she says, if a student does not know how to read, we teach that student to read. If a student does not know how to behave, we punish the child. This is the root of the problem. Educators need the agency to tackle the behavioral limitations of students in the same way they confront the academic limitations of students. Allow educators to teach students life skills, both academic and behavioral. Educators must adopt an anti-racist mindset when thinking about school climate. Being non-racist is not enough. Educators should confront systemic and overt racism at every level. Representative Hurt, your bill is a great first step to adhering to Amber's advice, and on behalf of the members of Education Minnesota, thank you for your time.
Thank you. I have next up Abdul. You've testified before, and I already butchered your name. I'm sorry. Come forward, state your name for the record, and proceed.
No worries. I'll just remind you, Idol, like American Idol. Then
Thank you.
For sure you will not.
Now I will remember it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Abdul, like Paul Abdul, but please don't ask me to sing or anything. So Madam Chair, members of the committee, good morning, or still morning. Good morning. My name is Idol Abdul. I am a Somali autism mom and advocate who, as I've said last time, would like to retire from advocacy. But I keep coming back because issues keep coming back. And I wrote I wrote my testimony and I sent it and I was going to read it, but after hearing people and reading your bill and hearing Hassan, Hassan and Representative Mariani's bills, I want to speak from the heart. And I understand when people say that a child is a child is a child is a child, and we want to give the control to local. I get it. But the problem is local hasn't been doing good. So then what? What do we do when the local school districts, when the teachers, when the principals, when the administrators have not been doing good and they have not been treating the children the same? Then you as legislators, you have got to step in, right? And I want to cite, I know James Brown said it's a man's world, but think about it. What if women were not allowed to vote? What if we said, let's leave that to the local polling place? Let's leave that to the local polling place. And many of you are women, and we left it to a bunch of men who were in the local polling place, and they picked and choose who they allowed to vote and who they did not allow to vote. I don't think any of us would be allowed here to vote. So I want to, when you say local, and I respect you, Representative Erickson, I've met you before, and I've worked with you before, and at that time it was about autism therapy for children with Medicaid, and I remember you were on our side because Huntley said, let the local people decide, let DHS decide. And I kept saying, well, DHS is not doing such a good job. And so you and Abler and Han and Berglund, I have met with you more times than I can count. And we then said, we're going to have the state, we're going to have the legislators tell us so that a kid with autism is a kid with autism is a kid with autism, whether you have Medicaid or whether you have private insurance or whether you are paying private. I want you guys to look at this, Madam Chair members. I want you to look at this from the same lenses. And I want you to look at it and say, we know research. I have cited, I am a researcher myself or aspiring to be one. But so research tells us that leaving it to the local, to the principals, to the teachers, and I agree with you, and I'm at the risk of pissing off the Democrats, there are ineffective teachers that are in the classrooms that are protected by the teachers' unions. I get it. But on the same coin, there are ineffective principals and administrators that are protected by the Republicans. So you have got to learn together. You have got to work together for the children. You have got to work together. You got to leave your, whatever it is, your aura, and I am just this person or that person, and my campaign has been donated by that group, this group. Leave all of that outside the door. You look at that child and you say, I'm going to make sure I teach you to your full potential, no matter where you come from. Right? This is America. Nobody chooses America because it's a bad country. We all love here. I remember when I was coming here, I didn't sleep for like a week. I'm going to the land of opportunity. I'm going to the land where people are going to judge me by the content of the character of my content, rather. Nobody cared what tribe I was. Nobody cared what skin color I was. That was my dream. I want that dream for my child. But he didn't get it. He didn't get it. There was a white child in Bloomington Public Schools that had autism and was never suspended when he would have a behavior. You know what the reason for that? They would say, well, autism is a behavior disorder. So they would get a non-exclusionary thing. They would get a behavior analyst. I remember this one particular white kid. He couldn't go to high school. He was still stuck in middle school. So the teacher and the principal made a decision to take him back to the middle school and have the teacher go there and then slowly bring him back to high school. Because the kids with autism are routine-oriented. That is what non-exclusionary is. That is what positive behavior support is. What my son, who has nonverbal autism, who won't even sit in a car because I have to lock this, they suspended him. And it ain't because I'm quiet. If nothing else, I'm loud. I'm a mama bear and a tiger bear together. But they suspended my kid. And you talked about, Representative Erickson, you said, the MDE, have them send guidance. I was friends with Casilius. I called her right away on her cell phone. I'm sure she regrets giving me her cell phone. And I said, what the heck? They suspended my kid. And she said, Idol, my hands are tied. My hands are tied. We gave them the guidance, but there's no law that says they have to follow it. That is where you come in. I'm going to end with that. I beg you, I appeal to your humanity. I appeal to your motherly, to your fatherly instinct. Please, please put children first.
Thank you, Ms. Abdul. I know you gave us some written testimony too. I'll make sure people get it. I'm going to go a few minutes over, but I'll add that twice as much to that, to the folks that have concerns. We just have two more people that had signed up. Mai Tao and then Matthew Shaver, if you could both come down and make it as quick as possible. Just state your name for the record and proceed.
Hello, my name is Mai Tao. Okay. I've been an educator for 6 years in St. Paul Public Schools, working with district's youngest learners. Over the years, as I have worked as an educator, I have seen really great things and some things that need more work. Such example is when students of color has been suspended for minor things, and students of color being sent out constantly. Really great things, such as teachers building great relationships in the building and restorative justices and practices. And this is what we should be doing prior to any suspension. In my career, I have seen young learners suspended. One student, I'll name him Timothy, who likes to play with stuffed animals, and he likes to say whoops in a really funny way. Unfortunately, Timothy was suspended for exhibiting challenging behaviors toward other students and adults when redirected in the classroom. At the time, Timothy was only 4 years old, and when the response to his behavior was not dealt with on a special level of understanding, which sent the message that he did not belong instead of the behavior not belonging in the classroom. When he returned to school after suspension, his behavior did not improve. In fact, upon returning, he regressed in his behavior from before suspension. Timothy didn't need to be pushed out, but he needed more services. I believe there is a lot that adults can and must do, and more adult training and best practices to build relationships to keep students in the classroom. In some cases, students need more support, such as mental health and more academic support staff in the classroom. Whatever the case, suspending our students is ineffective and harmful. That is why I'm asking you, Madam Chair, and committee members to support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you please state your name for the record and proceed?
Yep. Good morning, Chair Joachim. My name is Matt Shaver, and I've been a middle school teacher for 8 years. I currently teach reading and science at Northeast College Prep, a Title I school serving a diverse population in Minneapolis. I'm here today to support the non-exclusionary disciplinary policies outlined in HF 3396. This bill is important to both myself and my students, so thank you for considering it. I want to highlight one key behavior intervention that is often overlooked in these conversations. As a middle school teacher, I have found students who struggle the most with behavior choices tend to be the ones who also struggle with reading. This bill calls for academic screening for reading interventions as a non-exclusionary discipline policy. I support this, and to be clear, reading intervention itself and getting reading instruction right in the first place are in fact proactive discipline practices. As a state, we are doing an objectively mediocre job of teaching students how to read. We do a particularly lousy job of teaching students of color and students from low-income communities how to read. These are the same students who end up being disproportionately suspended and expelled at every grade level. This failure on our part leads to lifelong consequences for our students and is an economic drain on our state. The Literacy Project Foundation has found that 85% of young people in the juvenile justice system are functionally illiterate. When we talk about serious behavior choices that may warrant a suspension or expulsion, in addition to addressing the behavior mistake, we really need to think about whether we have taught that student how to read. Often these behavior choices are actually symptoms of illiteracy. If we truly want to change trajectories, end discipline disparities, and fulfill our responsibility to the next generation of young people in Minnesota, we must look to the science of reading to ensure all students become skilled readers. It's imperative that we move beyond simply excluding students and start addressing the underlying issues that lead to challenging behavior. HF 3396 is a good start, but not a good place to stop. Our students deserve better, and we can do better. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. No, we just went over. Everybody did a good job. So what I think I'm going to do is going to have 30 minutes for those, 31 minutes or 32 minutes for those concerned. And then we'll open it up and see if there's a few more people in the audience that wanted to say something that came down. And then take member questions. And so next we have up Principal Mark Mischke. Then we have Principal Tom Brenner, former Principal Mary McAbee, and then John Miller Hagan from the Minnesota Association of Elementary School Principals. I clearly cannot read a piece of paper today. So could you please state your name for the record and proceed?
All right. Good morning, Madam Chair and members. My name is Mark Mischke. I'm the principal at Buffalo High School. Have been there for the last 12 years, and I'm currently serving as the Minnesota Association of Secondary School Principals president over this year, last year and this year. So thank you for having us this morning. And first of all, the part I would like to start with for all of you is we as principals truly believe the most important thing is to provide an opportunity for every one of our children in our buildings, every single one of them. In my case, that's 1,850 students, to be able to walk into a safe school where they have the opportunity to learn. All of them. That is our task, that is our challenge, that is our purpose. We will never accomplish that to 100%, but we continue to work in that direction daily. So I am here to share with you some of the concerns that I would have in the bill that is proposed, House File 3396. I do recognize and identify the fact that we have a disparity in our suspension rates, a significant one. What I would tell all of you that hasn't been said yet this morning, we have solutions. We have solutions that will work and that have showed a change in the suspension rates. I want to share briefly the solution that has been a part of our school district and neighboring school districts over the last 8 years, and then just share some closing comments. So at our school district in 2011 and 12, we partnered with 7 other school districts in Wright County, St. Michael, Albertville, Monticello, just to name a few, to create an alternative to suspension program called the Right Choice Program. We agree that suspension from school, removing students from the school, creates a challenge for their education. We didn't do this because you made law. We did this because it was the right thing to do. And over the last 8 years, the Right Choice Program has continued to serve students and address the issues and the challenges that occurred with their behavior. Not by sending them home, but by trying to work through the challenges or work through the behavior, create a restorative opportunity for them to learn from their behavior so they can step back into the classrooms and be successful. Meanwhile, keeping the safety of the building and the school at the same time. Other pieces I could share with you more on the specifics, but I will hold on those out of respect to time and the other people that are here before me this morning. I would let you know that other people have solutions. It's not just us. We have 41 school districts currently in solution-seeking mode with beyond the 41, but 41 that are identified in working with MDE to solve this problem, and you'll hear from them this morning as well. The idea of eliminating suspensions doesn't solve the racial disparity or the concerns that are brought forth to you this morning. If anything, I would say they mask them even further. They hide them deeper into the school, into the community, or into your home or your community that you live in. Identifying this problem, bringing the data in front of us and analyzing it and looking how we can solve it is the only move to go forward. Because without the data, we don't know what's really happening. And if we eliminate the suspension process in our schools, it doesn't change the behavior. As you heard before me, the behaviors change through education and through work. Our program and the programs you hear about this morning do require funding. They require financial support. And in reality, everybody sitting at the table, what I would tell you is we do have solutions, but it does require financial support. Our program in particular is $175,000 annually. And as we partner with not only our school district, but the other school districts I mentioned, we are successful in making changes in behavior so kids can get back into school. and get an education that they need. So thank you for hearing me this morning.
Thank you, Principal Mischke. Just a reminder, we have House File 3396 before us, so it doesn't eliminate suspensions. The previous bills did that we had for informational only. So do you want to state your name for the record, and please proceed?
Thank you. My name is Tom Brenner. I'm the middle school principal in Cloquet. I appreciate you having me down. It was a great drive down. I respect all the work you do. Holy cow. This is crazy for me, a little guy. Mark, this is no big deal to him, but for a guy from up north, this is a big deal. So thank you for having me. I want to say hello to my students who might be watching me. They thought I was going to be on earlier. I think it's lunchtime now, so I think I got trumped. So I want to say hello and bonjour to them. So anyways, I am here just to tell you my story about, Cloquet is one of the 41 schools that was recognized by MDHR. And the initial process of that was denial. It's flat out. I'm a lifelong member of Cloquet. I've been a principal at Cloquet Middle School for 18 years. I felt like I was part of the community, part of our Fond du Lac community. I thought we did a good job. We immediately went to our American Indian kids who graduate way above American Indian kids in state, and how our kids score, our American Indian students score. So we wanted to justify, but the numbers are the numbers. Our American Indian kids were getting suspended at an extremely higher rate than our other students. There's just no denying it when you look at it. So we entered into an agreement with MDHR. And it was kind of a perfect storm for us, because at that time, we also had an integration achievement grant that we were working on, and we also qualified for the Circle grant. So through these grant dollars, we were able to bring in programming that we probably wouldn't have been able to bring into the system because of the dollar constriction. So before we were identified, we toured Mark's program. We tried to implement it in our county, but funds would not allow us to do that. So we were looking at the problem before we were identified with the problem to try to figure out solutions to it. We weren't able to afford that. But anyways, so we dove deep, and I want to say after our first year, this is year 2, after our first year, we eliminated suspensions by about 75%. And I'd like to pat myself on the back and our other administrators on the back, but really we didn't decrease the discrepancy. Didn't do it. All right. So now we are working through our integration achievement grant with the Cultural Responsive Schools for the University of Minnesota to look at how we can look at our practices through a biased lens, so we can have culturally responsive school practices in our school. But then we thought, that's not deep enough. Our kids are getting sent out of class. We need to change practices within the classroom. We need culturally responsive curriculum, and most of all, we need culturally responsive instructional practices where our kids, our American Indian students, feel welcomed in the classroom, feel like what they're learning about is important to them and their culture. And we can't do that without help. And we can't do that. We've done that now. We've started to form an equity group we're going to look at those practices, and we're going to do that organically with our school and with our Fond du Lac Indian Reservation and with our tribal leaders. That happened organically. That happens through the school. You can't legislate that. That's not going to happen. They're going to do something. They're going to provide. We're going to get programs. We're going to reduce suspensions, but we're still going to exclude kids. It's a deeper problem than that. It's in the classroom. It's the instructional practices. It's the curriculum we teach. It's our practices in getting through the classroom door. It's just plain and simple. And all administrators will tell you, it's hard to affect change to get through the classroom door. That takes dollars, that takes training, that takes help. So with that, I will give up to Mary, and thank you all for all the work you do.
Principal Brenner, thank you so much for driving all the way down and for the work that you're doing. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Hi, my name is Mary McBee. I'm the former principal at Central High School. I was in the St. Paul Public Schools for 50 years and principal at Central for 26 years. I also served as the state chair for the Board of School Administrators for 12 years. So just as a little background, I've been around a long time. I honestly tell you, the 26 years I spent at Central, we struggled with the disparity. We attacked it directly. I mean, when we looked at our data consistently, we disaggregated the data. I insisted that the district initially give us disaggregated data, which they didn't do 25 years ago, but now it's very routine. And we worked hard at looking at programs to try to alleviate the need for suspension. The district initially had an alternative school where for at least ninth graders who were suspended could actually attend school at a different site and not miss any kind of classroom. But most of these programs that were implemented soon disappeared because of funding. When I was last at Central, we got the Restorative Practices Grant to try to teach kids how to connect with each other, relate more with each other, to avoid the kinds of incidences that cause kids to be suspended. And in our district, we did have a discipline handbook which was very, very clear as to what constitutes a suspension as opposed to a dismissal. And in fact, when we wrote the suspension notices out, we had to actually quote the district discipline manual. So it had to be very distinct in terms of a particular kind of incident. Weapon possession, aggravated assault, selling drugs, very, very serious incidences that required some out-of-school time so that we could work on a plan for reentry for our students. We also, in our administrative wing, we precisely included a social worker as a part of our administrative team, so that when we had referrals that we thought could end up in something more difficult, that was the first line of referral. Sometimes it's just kids need to just talk out their problems, and without an administrator who they feel would be looking to discipline or to punish, but rather someone who wanted to listen and could help them solve their problems and their challenges. But it all comes with, as what the previous speaker said, it all comes with funding. We have tried after-school detention as an alternative. We ran a Saturday school at our school for kids who missed school during the week to make up. We recruited volunteers from the community to come in to help tutor them. And I found that as a high school principal, there's a real collaboration with failure rate and suspensions. And we track that too. I mean, we have kids who would fail 5 out of 6 classes, 4 out of 6. And it was very clear that something wasn't happening for them. Either they weren't relating to the instruction or to the teacher or to the school. And so it's a challenge to try to figure out this complicated issue of suspensions. And in Central, we didn't do a very good job, I can tell you that, and not without trying. And I'm still concerned, and I look at the data, and I don't know what to do. And in fact, I always tell people, if I knew the answer, I would sell it because I could make a fortune out of it. But and I want you to know, it's a complicated issue, and it's not that simple in terms of looking at a student and a discipline issue and what to do with that student. And we've tried all sorts of things. We've had student mediation. We also have counselor, social worker mediation. We had a rule that if you were in a fight, we didn't take sides. We were both disciplined, and then we investigated, and then we required the students to do a mediation upon return. Otherwise, we said that if it happened the second time, then we would double the consequences. But for high schools, I think it was important for us to work with our staff and our administrators to establish good relationships with our students. We found out if we kept a student with an administrator for 4 years, with a counselor for 4 years, at least they had a history with that kid, could understand them more clearly, and maybe have a better understanding of what their concerns or their challenges, their family issues were, and so that we tried to treat them as individuals, not as just a suspended student. But so I'm ambivalent about this bill. because I see the need for sometimes excluding students if it's especially a serious offense that will impact the entire school. But I also know that they need extra support that right now, as a building, we can't provide because of funding. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. McAbee, and thank you so much for your years of public service. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Representative Joachim, members of the Education Policy Committee. I'm John Miller-Hagan. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Elementary School Principals Association. I was a principal in Austin, Minnesota, and Bloomington, Minnesota for 20 years, and I served schools with high poverty and EL and Title I students. And this has been a very enlightening day, and we appreciate the testimony from all the folks here. As I represent 1,000 elementary public and charter school and middle level principals, I can share with you that the day-to-day for principals is really to be solution-oriented and to find the best paths for our students. Some days that comes somewhat difficult. Sometimes when we're dealing with a behavior incident, it comes at a time when you're not ready for it. One of the things we haven't mentioned here is sometimes you'll deal with 2 or 3 at the same time. And I clearly know what it means. I'm married to a mama bear, and I know I always engaged and was enjoyed connecting with parents that wanted the best for their children. I used to say the biggest trouble I had was when I couldn't find parents. And the amount of time it takes to sort these incidents out and to come to strong and good resolutions, it can be hours and hours to do that work. I would also add that for most of us in this room, we have been or grew up experiencing a behavior model that was based on punishment. That's a pretty common model and expectation from people in our environments. In today's world, we have learned just most recently a lot about trauma-sensitive schools, implicit bias, and we're responsible for addressing and meeting the needs of children from those frames. As an association, for the last 4 years, we've dedicated significant amount of professional development to implicit bias, cultural responsiveness for principals and teachers, and also behavior and we have a program called Responsibility-Centered Discipline. All of those components come at a cost, as one of our other members stated. Back to the classroom or the school, if you do some sort of a response for a child that's dysregulated, that takes staffing, it takes a space, it takes a program, a curriculum, and not all of our schools have that funding and have those resources. There's actually a lot of research around what we can do and what we know to do, but we have significant limitations in staffing and people that are prepared to do these things, and in the funding for space and the curriculums. So the other thing we haven't talked a little bit about is the recovery plan component for families when a child is dysregulated. To push a child right back into a classroom without a real groundwork and foundation around how that child is going to be successful in that classroom, that work takes time. To help support teachers in the classroom and to have them be ready to receive a child and to rebuild the flow and the momentum of their instruction, that takes time and skill sets in order to do. The component of suspending a child sometimes in unique situations is helpful as a timeout. As we all, as adults, need to step aside or step back, regroup, and then come back in. I see that as one of the ways that suspensions would help us. at least the use and the possibility of using it. But judicious use of suspensions and a commitment to non-exclusionary forms of behavior management, I think that's all workable. But we need to have staff and principals and teachers taught and brought along and have an opportunity to clearly understand those behaviors and those practices as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miller-Hagen.
Miller-Hagen.
Thank you. Is there anybody else in the audience? We still have a little bit more time. Actually, those with concerns have a little bit more time, like 10 minutes. If you wanted to have anybody add anything, I want to make sure we're being fair. I'm not seeing any. Is there anybody else in the audience that wanted to add something to the conversation? We have about 10 minutes. With that, then we're, Representative Herr, would you like to have any closing statement, not closing statements, but any statements before we go to questions, or do you want to wait?
I can wait.
Great. Members, I have signed up for questions so far. I have Representative Gruenhagen.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks for the testifiers, both pro and con. At least we get to hear both sides of the story, and I think that's always important when you're dealing with difficult problems. You know, during my tenure on the 16 years on the school board, no, 16, I got involved with quite a few disciplinary situations, okay? For whatever reason, I was available because of my business right downtown Glencoe. Parents would call me, sometimes the school district would call me, and so I've been in some very difficult situations during that time, where there was crying, yelling, screaming, pointing fingers at each other, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, there's a couple that were especially egregious, though, and I'd just like to share one of those situations without anybody's names to illustrate a point that I want to make about this discussion. And that is, this particular was a middle school, and the principal happened to be a very capable woman as a middle school principal. And by the way, I just want to say this about public school employees. You know, some of the hardest working, most dedicated, and well-intentioned people I've ever met in my life have been public school employees, teachers, administrators. You know, they just want to do their very best, okay? But in this particular situation, and this went on for about a year, and this happened to be a young boy, and he was restrained at one time, but his mom was a mama bear, and she was standing up for him. And it just, you know, it seemed like every week to 2 weeks, there was something that blew up at the school district. And I got involved a number of times, both by the principal's request and also by the parents. But I can remember one time I went up to the middle school, and there had been another blow up, and it happened to be at the end of the school day. And so I went up there, and I went to the secretary's office. I said, is, you know, Principal so-and-so in? And she kind of gave me a blank stare and kind of shook her head yes, but it wasn't kind of like, you should go in there right now. But I thought, well, I know what this is about. So I went into her office, and she literally was sitting at her desk with her head laying on the desk, okay? She had her head laying right on the desk. So I said, had another problem with so-and-so, and they said, and she didn't even lift her head up. She just, yep. I said, you know, I believe in public education. I'm a supporter of public education, okay? But I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, I said to the principal, don't you think it would be nice to have school choice to empower this parent, who is a low-income parent, with the money to send their child to a parochial religious school, a private school, or whatever school they wanted to have, because this is not working. Now, this principal was a ardent supporter also of public education. But with her head laid down on the desk, okay, she simply shook her head yes, okay? Because what I'm trying to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, in these situations that I was involved with over a period of years, sometimes I'd come down on the school side to defend them. And, you know, the principal said it takes hours. I would argue it takes days, weeks, and months in some situations, okay? And I'm sure he would agree. And sometimes I'd come down on the parent side, okay? Depending on hearing both sides of the issue. And I was sometimes invited into mediation meetings or whatever as an advocate for parents or whatever. The point is this: we can sit here and try to sort all this stuff out within this structured system. But in some cases, the best thing to happen is for that parent to have the ability to change schools with their child, empowered financially to do so. And you know what? If it's the parent and the child's problem primarily, maybe they'll figure it out as they switch schools, that maybe I have to take some responsibility here rather than always blaming the school. Maybe it's the school's responsibility or problem. I'll finish.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had a question there.
Yeah,
Representative
it's coming.
Hagan.
I'm setting the table.
Get to it quicker, please.
5 minutes away from that.
Yeah.
Better not be.
You know, sometimes I think it's the school and the child just needs a different setting. And I know that, so I don't think these bills are going to make much difference. They are going to make a lot of misery on teachers. That I can believe, okay? Trying to deal with disruptive situations. The point is this: when I got out of the Marine Corps, I got a GI Bill. It was federal tax dollars. I could cash that check into a religious college, a private college, or a public college. That was my choice. And I could make as many switches as I wanted to, all right? We need to free up the system to competition. Competition will solve what billions of dollars of tax dollars and rearranging the deck chairs won't.
Representative Gruenhagen, we are not a finance committee, we're a policy committee.
I know.
Could you please get to a question?
Okay, the point is, we need the minority students to become middle-class citizens and productive. And the way to do that is with opportunity scholarships. So my question is to Mr. Milligan, or Millihagan. My name is Gruenhagen, so maybe we're related, I don't know. But if he's around.
If he's lucky.
Oh, there he is.
Mr. Miller-Hagen, please come down, and Representative Gruenhagen, a lot of latitude right now.
I know,
Good
I
question.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
But this is the question. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Millihagen, that at some times the best circumstance for a particular child or parent-child, when there's conflict to a very high level, that they need a different setting, might be a good opportunity for them, and that sometimes maybe they'll realize it's not the school's fault. They need to make some adjustments in their own actions, beliefs, and behaviors.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Miller-Hagen.
Actually, what I found in my work in my school was long-term relationships with families and continuing to meet and work with them yielded great results. And so, frankly, from a perspective of a child has consistency in the classroom and with the teacher, and they're able to stay in that room and to come from a place of conflict into a place of peace and harmony with their age mates and their teachers and the environment in the school. That's a huge success. Success for parents and success for the student, and it's actually a success for our school. Oftentimes, especially parents of poverty, aren't able to move and to to leave schools and to make changes, and it would also disrupt brothers and sisters, siblings, and that sort of thing. So I'm a believer that we keep our children with us in our buildings, and we do the best we can to meet their needs every day.
Representative Herr, follow up.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Gruenhagen, for your question. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that you said. I want to first make sure that we understand that structural racism is not a public school issue. Structural racism exists in private schools, they exist in charter schools, they exist everywhere. Moving a child who is experiencing disproportionate behavioral discipline in a public school and putting them into a private school doesn't change the structural racism that impacts that child. I'm going to give you an example, a real life one, my example. My children didn't always go to public school. I had the privilege of being one of those minorities that are middle class. I sent my children to private school. One of them was a religious institution. My child, who was tested as gifted and talented, my children are brilliant, started talking when she was 3 years old, full sentences, started reading when she was 3 years old. She went to kindergarten at a private school that continually told us that she was a problematic child, kept telling us that homework was not turned in. I started, as a person of color who was taught to doubt my entire self, my entire life, and I am a very educated, outspoken person. I started questioning my child. I started questioning myself. That teacher made our lives hell, and this was the best school, in a private school, in that place that we lived. My child developed trichotillomania, pulled out all of her facial hair, pulled out all of the hairs on anywhere in her body. And what I started, I, as a parent who, again, understands how to navigate institutions, could not navigate this institution, could not navigate the state's education system, and that was supposed to help me out with this, could not navigate that. What I started doing was the teachers started blaming me and my daughter for not doing work. I started going, I kept every single piece of work my children ever did. I have like 30 boxes of things, even scribbles that I kept. I started going through those boxes, and I realized she actually graded those homework, gave them back to us, and then told us we hadn't turned those in. Do you think that that teacher was looking at my child? Had it been any other child, would she have experienced these things? She was the only child of color in that room, the only child experienced this. And when I started talking to other parents, she said to me, you best not talk to other parents, because if people know your child is not performing, they'll start treating your family poorly. And I'm like, you're the only one treating our children, my child and my family poorly. What she was doing to my child happened in a private school. So taking a child out of a public school and giving them the choice to go somewhere else does not dismantle racism. So I just want to be really clear about that point. And I did have a couple of other points, but I'm gonna save those, Madam Chair. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Herr. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to the principals, thank you for your efforts. If I'm guilty of supporting you, I will not apologize, because I stand up for both teachers and principals. And as you know, I authored the principal evaluation bill, and so you're under a lot of stress, I'm sure, from that. But I taught those Saturday school days when students in my high school were expelled, and I tell you, it took a lot of effort. But you have to develop that relationship with those kids, and they were all boys, and they were white, yes. But they survived. It would take many weeks, many Saturdays to address their issues, but it can be done. And I say that parents were probably my best support, because they wanted their children to succeed, and they were there helping me. But aside from that, Madam Chair, I think we should refer this bill to Education Finance, listening to the concerns that have come from the testifiers, because we do need to spend dollars on helping teachers and administrators be trained in policies or procedures that might come from the department or might come from a program like Buffalo uses to help them. And then later, I'm going to have, after Representative Herr gives her closing, I would like an oral amendment to offer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Erickson. If you care to share that oral amendment before you offer it, that would be wonderful. And have talked to Finance. They don't need to see this bill at this time, but I'm sure that they will be seeing trauma-informed education money, a bill to provide money for that. They're going to be seeing money for para support, money for all different kinds of training to help make sure that our districts have the resources to do what they need to do this job, to keep kids in school. Representative Herr.
Madam Chair, I did just want to add one more thing that I forgot to add. Is that okay if I do that right now? So I just wanted to address one more point about giving children a fresh start. At first, when Adosh and I sat down to look at the governor's bill, I was a little bit concerned about line 2.1 that talked about transmitting records must document any service a pupil requires to prevent the inappropriate behavior from reoccurring. Because I thought about some of the unintended consequences, but now after hearing Representative Gruhang, I am complete support of this. Because if a child's record indicates what they've experienced and that goes with that child, then that new school is aware, can provide the supports, and can give that child the services that they need, because it's really important for that child to get a fresh start. And so I just want to point out that this, if we're looking at giving fresh starts, children can have a fresh start. This bill doesn't prevent them from doing that, and this bill actually ensures that they have the best fresh start they possibly can.
Thank you, Representative Herr. Representative Baker.
Madam Chair, thank you. And I was going to ask Mr. Mischke to come down again, the principal from Buffalo. And while he makes his way down, I was.
You might want to sit close to the back here. Sorry to interrupt you, Representative Baker.
Thank you.
I don't want to waste too much.
Because I want to wait, yeah, I want to
time.
keep it going. Thank you, and I'll be very, very brief. I was, and again, I'm actually going to have you address something that the middle school teacher was talking about, and he left. And so I'm going to kind of put you on the spot, just to ask the question. He really struck me by his, as he teaches middle school science and how he sees some of these behavior issues are really connected to reading and the inability for a lot of students to connect what they're trying to read. So to the principal, and again, if you can maybe try to elaborate this, what I've heard from school districts is that our second, third grade timeframes of reading connections are really important, and yet we are bringing kids through the system when they shouldn't be brought through because they aren't learning it in third and fourth grade. When they get to the sixth, seventh grade, they're not ready. Why is it, and you can help me with this, I'm kind of new to the committee, why is it that we are pushing these kids through when they really need to have an extra year in many cases to have that extra year or two to get the connections with reading and comprehension? Are we failing? Would that help us solve some of these problems we're trying to fix on the back end of we're talking about in-school suspensions and more work and more discipline on the administrators? Will that start helping change many of these situations that we're causing because kids are having some behavioral issues when they aren't able to comprehend?
Go
And
ahead.
if you can't answer it, I understand, because I
Mr.
threw you a
Mischke,
loop,
go ahead.
sorry.
Principal Mischke, sorry.
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Your opinion.
Yeah, to answer your question, in part to start with, yes, there's a correlation between students' ability to be successful academically, in particular with the reading ability within correlation to their behavior, potential suspensions or behavior disciplinary issues or problems. I guess what I would say is it's a pretty complicated answer to your question, but yes, there's directly a correlation between that. And I think proactive interventions for reading earlier and earlier so students can be successful in the classroom and feel like what they see in front of them is something they are capable of understanding and reading is huge and very important, and not all the way through. So as they come into a high school student, ninth grade student, I could speak a little bit more specifically to that. Those gaps definitely have a correlation to students that struggle with behavior because they get disengaged and they aren't able to move through the curriculum or through the materials in front of them, and so that's a challenge for them. And so as simply as saying we should hold them back, it isn't as simple as that, because if you hold them back with the same practice, the same behavior occurs or the same challenge still exists. I think there's tiers of intervention along the way from K through 12 as far as reading intervention, a tier 2 intervention as we describe it, that brings that student back into the classroom. I hesitate to say that the primary solution is to delay their move forward versus providing intervention as they stay in their grade level. So ninth grade, let's say they're struggling with English the first week of school, they're struggling with their reading ability. We do provide and we should be providing a reading intervention that allows them to come back into that classroom and be able to complete that work while having that additional support that they need to be able to be successful. So I think my answer to you briefly would be holding them back isn't the solution. Providing interventions along the way and allowing them to continue to use good practices to fill those gaps, because there's a year worth of school, there's so many specific gaps that are there. To hold them back wouldn't be the solution.
And Madam Chair, just to follow up,
Mr. Representative Baker?
you're absolutely right, and I'm not questioning some of that. I think there's some correctness there in that, as well as if we can't catch them when they're younger and we can't get the interventive stuff that you're talking about kind of corrected, the moving them along is only going to make it worse if they are just not there yet. So time is a gift in public schools, in any school. So I'm looking forward to more of these conversations, because I think that's still part of our problem is we are pushing through kids because of maybe a lot of parental pressure, maybe we just want to move them along, but we have to start looking at that as some just need more time too. But that's all my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just?
Briefly, Mr.
Yep,
Mischke,
one
Principal
sentence.
Mischke.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I was just going to say as an affirmation for what you're saying. In the past, we look at graduation and time as a constant. And what I would say to your point, and I think to echo some of the sentiments of many of our educators, time isn't the constant. Time should be variable. The graduation and successful completion of their educational career is the constant. Everybody should have the opportunity to eventually be successful. And that time is the variable. I would agree with you wholeheartedly on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay right there. It sounds like Representative Bierman has a question for you. Representative Bierman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Mr. Mischke. I think you and the gentleman actually from Cloquet, if he wants to come down here too, I wanted to just ask the two of you. I think what I heard from you two was it's sort of an example. You two are both examples of, the local schools and the culture you create in your school and your goals of wanting to teach and reach all kids. I mean, it's what I hear and see when I go into my local school. So I applaud you both for the work you're doing, and thank you for being here to talk with us more about it. This whole education issue, it's as complex as all the kids and the moving parts that you have going in your school building every day. So I know it's a lot of work, and nothing we do here with one law is the magic bullet in solving an issue or a problem like we're looking at here. But I did want to hear a little bit more as you spoke about the right choice and that program. And I wanted to hear from maybe with your experiences in Cloquet as well, what could you point to in this bill that overlaps with the work you've been doing and is going in the same direction? And what is maybe an item or two that you feel is problematic, if any, because I kind of sense that, you're not on board with this, and what are the problems you foresee? And then, you could start with that.
Whichever you would like to take it, just state your name for the record again and proceed, and please try to make it brief.
State my name again. Mark Mischke, principal at Buffalo High School. Thank you, Madam Chair. What I'd say as far as the challenge, the contradiction with the bill in terms of the increased in terms of level of expectation for when a removal from class would occur, and some of the specific language in there that brings it to the point of, I apologize, I don't have the bill in front of me, but immediate harm or danger to the classroom in terms of some of the language that's put into the bill that we're looking at. I apologize, but there's specific language in there that brings that level higher in terms of what would be the only reasons for exclusion from the classroom. And I look at that level, and to meet that level of expectation or that level, that bar, creates a major challenge in terms of any opportunity or any potential to redirect behaviors that don't necessarily bring about an immediate danger to the classroom, but yet do cause disruption and cause challenges within the classroom. So I don't have the specific wording in front of me to your question about where I see the conflict. I do now.
Thank you, that would be helpful, because I am not finding that.
Yeah,
in the-
so the wording says the only exception for is if the student, it's in section 5, I apologize, section 5. The only exception is if the student creates an immediate and substantial danger to self or property. That is the bar at which it's set at. And so that would create a challenge in terms of the practices that we use right now when situations occur that don't necessarily create an immediate or substantial danger to self or property.
Madam Chair, could you, and Mr. Mischke, could you?
That's actually underlying. Representative Mischke, Principal Mischke, that's actually underlying language that you're looking at, not anything that's being added.
Madam Chair, I just want to point out that the section that the testifier is referring to actually is not changed language. What I'm reading in 4.2, it says, except where it appears that the people create an immediate substantial danger to self or surrounding persons or property. That's the same language that's in law right now, so there's no difference. That's not new language.
Madam Chair, maybe we could just move on. When you were talking about your Right Choices program, you said you could expand on that just a little bit, the things you're doing now that you're finding that are effective. I was interested in hearing a little bit more of that, too.
Principal Mischke.
Thanks, Madam Chair. As far as practices that are effective, for example, it's a restorative base process. So student is suspended, typically would be suspended from school where they would be sent home for a behavior that for 3 to 5 days, let's say, for example, a student gets in a fight in a classroom. Okay, so we are suspending that student instead of sending them home and then just hoping that the problem is solved and that they come back with a new, a new look on how to be successful. The Right Choice program actually is housed at a historic county courthouse in our school district with a licensed teacher and a support paraprofessional. All academic work is accomplished, collected from the respective school districts, provided by a licensed teacher so they can stay up academically and keep moving forward on their work, and that is not compromised. In addition, there are restorative practices that are walked through a curriculum called True Thought, where you dig into the behavior and why it occurs and how do you have it not occur in the future. And then there's also a mediation, as some of my colleagues up here have referenced, potential mediation if there's a victim involved, whether it be a peer or whether it be a teacher or whether it be a staff member, and then a reentry plan with the family so that we talk about what it looks like when that student comes back into the building so they don't just step back in without the tools to be successful. And so that is a brief description of what it would look like. It brings the student off campus so they can work through those pieces, and then also allows for that reentry to be successful as well, too. So that would be an example of the program.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I didn't see you there. I thought you were missing in action.
I'm here.
All right, thank you. I can move on if you have more questions.
Representative Jordan has a follow-up on just this point, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Principal Mischke, for being here. Is there something in this bill that would prevent you from doing that program? I think it sounds really great. I love the focus on restorative justice. I love the focus on intervention and correcting this behavior. What in this bill would prevent you from, if and when this bill is enacted into law, what here would prevent you from still doing that program?
Principal Mischke.
I think some of the specific wording that's in here, and I apologize for the inaccuracy, I would, in terms of the reference to the bill piece. I think what we have seen from the bill in terms of the increase in level of bar set in terms of what would allow that opportunity for removal from class and the non-exclusionary pieces, the idea of that there needs to be an intervention in that classroom, a non-exclusionary intervention in that classroom prior to this being able to happen. In the situations that we work for a student, like I described it briefly, we need to, that in order for that to happen, they need to be removed from the classroom. It can't happen within that classroom setting in order to be able to be addressed. And so the concern from my seat is that we would not be able to remove that student from that classroom in order to be able to have our program, to have them be a part of a Right Choice program, that they would be expected to stay in that classroom and not be able to be removed.
Representative Jordan, quick follow-up.
Madam Chair, maybe this is a question for Representative Herr then. Representative Herr, I don't see where your bill actually prevents a removal at any point. It does, maybe my understanding is incorrect, but maybe this just says that the first step is a non-exclusionary discipline, but is there a point where we are actually preventing suspensions in this bill at all?
Representative Herr.
Madam Chair, Representative, you are correct. So if you look at Section 5, it does state that provision of alternative programs, no school shall dismiss any people without attempting to. We're adding new language of use, non-exclusionary discipline policies and practices, old language, before dismissal proceedings, new language or pupil withdrawal proceedings, except when, this is old language, this is current language, except for where it appears that the people will create an immediate and substantial danger to self or surrounding persons or property, school districts can still suspend students. We're actually giving what teachers have been asking for a long time, more tools to help them manage their classrooms.
Thank you, Representative Herr. I've got Representative Erdahl. Thank you, you've been waiting. And then I have Representative Waslowick, Sandell, Jordan, and MKP, Hassan, and then Representative Kunesh-Podein, I think. We'll get it right. Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The danger in making me wait is I get more things to think about and ask. First of all, referencing Representative Baker's concerns about passing along, we have a greater concern in that we are graduating about one-third of our graduates who go to college then have to do remedial education as well. And, I agree with Glenn on almost everything. But on the issue that he brought up.
This is on video, you know.
Well, then a little less than everything. But he's talking about the need to have choice and go to private schools. The one little caveat we need to consider with that is that these children who are having problems in one school who wish then to maybe go to a private school, they have the ability to say, no, you can't come. And so they don't have to take on the private, in the private school, children who are having problems in the public school if they don't want to. Now, this is a very interesting discussion today. There are major problems that need to be considered. The solutions are difficult to grasp because, for one thing, our school districts have different needs and different resources to deal with those needs. I do have a concern that an impact in this could be, and we have a shortage of teachers now, that we may lose more teachers simply because they don't want to face these situations without some type of remedy. So, again, it's a big problem. I'm glad for this discussion, and hopefully through some legislation we can find an adequate solution. Now I have a brief commercial message. I spent 35 years in the classroom, and Mr. Mischke is as we know, a principal in Buffalo, and my first cousin, Carlton Erdahl, is a higher level math teacher under Mr. Mischke in Buffalo. And Carlton is in, I believe, his 53rd year of teaching full-time. So 35 is nothing compared to that. I had no question.
Thank you, Representative Erdahl. We're working on something here right now. So I have Representative Hassan next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the current formula that we have right now works for white students, but every time we bring disparities and solutions to disparities, administrators come to us and tell us, oh, you have to fully fund schools. We need more funding. So for anybody, any of the administrators in the room, what works for white students right now, why can't that work for students of color and indigenous students? Anybody?
Principal.
Tom Brenner.
Brenner, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I explained earlier, I think there's more to the problem, and there are injustices. I agree with you. We have to do that through working into our school spaces so they're comfortable places for our children. We have to work into our classrooms so we're instructionally. There's best instructional practices that work with our American Indian students that are not happening in the classroom. We have to penetrate the classroom with those practices so they're not sent out, so they feel like that space is theirs too. And so it's deeper. The problem's deeper than just suspension. That's maybe the fever or the temperature. That's what recognizes it. But we have to go deeper than that. And if I can, Mark's program is outstanding. Like I said, we went down and toured it and tried to bring it back. financially, we can't afford it. Mark works in a district where his tax base, they're allowed to raise money for their school. We can't in Cloquet. Our taxpayers won't do an excess referendum. They're almost to the max. They almost have $1,000 per kid more than we do to support programs like that. So that's a huge, we'd love to run a program. We tried to run a program, but we can't. Now we have those programs in place. We're looking at a deficit now. Now it comes to me, do I keep this program in place or do I cut teachers and increase class sizes? So, I mean, because it's not equal. It's not. And let's just be honest about it. It costs more to educate some children. Let's be honest.
Thank you. Thank you, Principal Brenner. We have Representative Representative
a
Hassan,
follow-up,
follow-up. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
So are suspensions and expulsions part of the disparity problem? Madam Chair.
Principal Brenner?
Do I state my name again, or do I? Okay. I guess I don't understand the question.
No, I'm asking,
Representative
are
Hassan.
suspensions and expulsions part of the disparity problem? You said the problem is not only suspension, so I want to know, are suspensions and expulsions part of the,
I think
students of color
overall,
problem?
Representative Brenner. Principal
I'm
Brenner.
sorry.
Sorry, I demoted you.
I think overall, yes, they're part of the problem, but I think the problem goes deeper. I think it's like, why are these kids getting sent out? And it goes to some of the, like the teacher talked about, reading disparities and stuff like that. There's more to it that a bill just won't cover. We're working now with our local Indian Education Committee and with our tribal leaders, and they're a sovereign nation. And so we have to, it's a different animal doing that. And so we have to work together to come up with solutions for our kids. And a lot of that is making them feel like that space is theirs. And I have about 10 years left, and that's what I'm going to do, unless you guys want to work on the rule of 90. I just missed it by a smidge.
Representative Hassan, one quick follow-up, and then just to let folks know, I've got 4 more testifiers, then we're going to take a quick break. And then we'll go to 4 more questions, then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back.
I'm sorry, I'm
Representative
asking
Hassan.
too many questions, but, so if suspensions and expulsions are part of the problem, and we want to fix the problem, all of us want to fix the problem, and I'm glad that you mentioned the indigenous students. They're 10 times more likely to be suspended and expelled than any other group. Then what is wrong with coming up with a solution to tackle part of the problem?
Principal Mishki. Oh, he has.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just as an awareness as far as the committee too, right now, we have 41 school districts that are already moving into an agreement, including Mr. Brenner's, to solve the problem. And so the request right now is to let us continue what we're currently doing and what we're moving forward with in partnerships, what Mr. Brenner's doing and the other 40 school districts that are in these partnerships already, that are seeing success in addressing the issue. That is the request in terms of allowing us to continue to move forward with those partnerships.
Representative Hassan.
Make a comment and I'll be done. So if I were to go along with the administrator's testimonies, this is the picture that I see. White students can show up as they are. They will be supported. They will be, taught, and they will succeed. And students of color and black, brown, and indigenous students have to be mended, changed, and we have to look for extra funding every time we bring up the disparity. That's what I'm walking away from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Hassan. Representative Waslawick.
I just wanted, I don't really remember what I was going to ask, so I'm just going to pass it this time. I think most of my questions have been answered. The one concern I do have, I think, with all of this conversation is that this is likely going to require a lot of staff training, and I have concerns that the date of enactment is this coming school year. So that's my biggest concern, is that, depending on where things go with the legislative session, this may not be passed until May, and we're talking not a lot of time for folks to prepare and train staff. So that's the one concern that I have, and I'll leave it to others to answer questions, ask questions.
Thank you, Representative Wozniak. I just wanted to point out there's no date of enactment, so it'd be August 1st. I believe, am I accurate, or am I missing it?
Effective dates are different, but effective dates are this coming school year for 2021.
What line are you seeing that on?
Page 4.
4?
So I don't know if.
Oh,
that
I see what you're saying.
everything up until that point, or.
Yeah, I think it's just for that section. Each section has its own effective date, so we can definitely have that discussion as well. Thank you for pointing that out. Representative Sindel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I have a comment rather than a direct question. I spent most of my career teaching history or studying history, and while I was at the Historical Society writing history, and one of the issues that I faced in my career is thinking about the way we understand our past influences the way we look at the world in which we live. History doesn't repeat itself. There's never a unique situation in the past which exists presently in the future, but the way we look at our past does have an influence. I remember a teacher of mine in college saying that times change and so do the minds of men and women. He was talking then about a couple of books which we had read in class, one by Oscar Handlin called The Nation of Immigrants, another one written by Carl Degler called Out of Our Past. And Handlin's book had been written in the 1940s, and he talked about immigration as a mixing bowl here in this country. He suggested that the process of integration and assimilation had been particularly unique here, and it was something for which we might be proud and the way we might look at our future. Degler, writing a while later, said that that's not right. He said this nation is a nation that might be identified as a salad bowl in which all the ingredients have their independence and individualities and should be respected and understood and appreciated for each of those individualities. And rather than mixing all the ingredients together and imagining that something is going to come out at the end, we should understand the fact that we are a nation of people with distinct pasts and understandings. Now, neither one of those metaphors, I guess, is really complex enough to understand the world in which we live, and I understand that as well. But we've talked today for a long time about an issue of civil rights, and I guess I'd like to talk about the issue of respect. If we respect all the individuals, all the different parts of this world in which we live, we wouldn't have to talk about the civil rights that we're arguing about today. Civil rights has been an enormously important element of our nation's history, and we've passed laws which have protected the civil rights of individuals. I have no idea if any of these bills are going to pass into law during this session. They'll pass the House probably, and they'll get to a conference committee probably, and some of the elements might be adopted, but I don't think they're going to be passed into law as they are now. The important thing about this conversation is we are talking about the civil rights. We're talking about the civil rights of the people around the room. We're talking about the civil rights of the people who are our children in our schools, and those are the issues, I guess, that I'd like to talk about. Whether a child can be expelled or removed from a classroom or whether a parent should be brought in, all of those are important things, as the teachers around the room understand. But it's the fundamental respect of individuals in our society for other individuals in our society that's so wanting. And it's disparaging, I guess, sometimes disheartening to think that we're struggling and arguing about whether students should be expelled and under what circumstances they should be pushed out of the classroom, when it's fundamental respect that all of us who have taught, and there are half a dozen of us around the room who have taught school, we didn't get into this in order to punish students. We got into this because we wanted to embrace the humanity of all those students. And we didn't, none of us around the room got into this business of legislation because we wanted to punish people. We're doing it because we wanted the best for people. My concern is that the work you two fellows are doing in school is remarkable. It's wonderful. And I want all of us to say, what is the best way we can go forward to establish an appreciation for the respect of all children in our classrooms and make sure that all children have this opportunity of finding a life that they're proud of, successful, and can be independent citizens. Sorry to take so much time, but I feel so strongly about this issue, Madam Chair, that I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Representative Sindel. Representative Jordan.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I had some questions for some of the parent and family advocates. I don't know if they are still here. Cool. And I do also really want to thank our principals. It really does sound like you're doing great work, and it really is a failure of this legislature if we're dealing with that kind of disparities in funding for your districts. So thank you for your work. It's really important.
Representative Jordan, go ahead. Your question.
Hi.
Hi.
One of the things that really excites me about this bill as well is some of the connections for parents. And I know you talked about your nieces as well, but I know can you talk a little bit about can you talk a little bit about what it would mean for the district to be providing mental health and counseling services available with through this law?
Oh, yeah.
Could you please state your name for the record and please be brief?
Erica Valiant. So it would actually mean a lot, specifically with my niece. She is diagnosed with PTSD because she has suffered some abuse in the past. The school is aware of that and was aware of that since she started back in 7th grade. She's in 8th grade now. She just started getting counseling maybe a month ago. This year in 8th grade from an outside resource. When we did have our school board meeting, they talked about the fact that they were assessing her for special needs. And we also talked about the fact that my sister asked them to do that last year, but it didn't happen. And that also that they could start a 504 right now so that she could get some help until those assessments are done. But, you know, honestly, if there were mental health professionals in the school, that would be a tremendous help for a lot of our children because, honestly, the school culture is very white, even for teachers of color, and they're really stepping into a different culture and they're expected to act in a way that is different from what they normally do at home. Right, and it's not that for white kids, just because they're stepping into their own culture. So I think that's something that people don't think about. And maybe it's because they haven't experienced it, because it's, you know, for a dominant culture, it is dominant culture, that's the thing. But yeah, mental health professionals in the schools would be very helpful, because a lot of times kids just need to talk through stuff, or they need somebody to understand them, or they want to be seen. And maybe, you know, staff just don't have time to do it in the way that kids need it to be done.
Thank you. Representative Jordan, follow up quick.
Yeah, I guess one other question then might be, and Ms. Valiant, I don't know if you're the person to ask this to, but do you think that would help with some of the underlying behavior issues that the school is reporting in the first place if students had access to that mental health?
Yes.
Ms. Valiant, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. I think we have just Representative Kunesh-Bodine and the members. We are going to take a 10-minute break and come back. We might have an oral amendment that we're working on right now. Representative Kunesh-Bodine.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Herr, for being the champion that you are. Your heart is in the right place, and we hear it loud and clear, so I want to thank you for that. This bill perhaps has gone into different avenues than it was intentioned. This is a proposal for non-exclusionary discipline. It doesn't propose changes to prohibit dismissals in public schools, and it's a great starting point. This has been an incredible discussion. It has certainly ferreted out so many of the issues that we are dealing with in our schools, and I really appreciate the work and the processes that the principals have put in place. As a teacher myself in a middle school and being in the elementary school, I've seen many of the behaviors that cross the realm of our students, and it's not always just our kids of color either. There are plenty of kids, white kids, upper class kids, kids that have every opportunity in the world that have their own unique situations, and it is difficult to address every single child's need, but it does take the entire community, the academic, the school community, to look at that child. And so often I've had the experience of working with a student that has some really challenging behaviors. And I think when we talk about how much relationships matter, the relationships that the principals have with the parents, that the parents have with the teacher, and the kind of communication that goes back and forth. Those are things that we can do that don't cost it any money at all. And so as we are looking at this bill, Let's remember that it's on the suggestion of our governor, who is an educator, whose wife is an administrator, who many of us are teachers on this committee who support this bill. And it is a starting point. It is a discussion point for us. It doesn't prohibit suspensions. If anything, it almost gives these principals kudos for the work that they are doing. And so in so many of the cases, it sounds like our districts are already doing this. And so putting this statute in place not only supports perhaps or gives them fodder for looking for extra help from our state government and our legislature, but it also gives them the reward of the work that they are doing, because they're doing it without being mandated. And sometimes, I know what it's like when we have that trickle-down mandate from the legislature. Every fall, we'd get together and we'd hear, well, here's what the legislature is mandating this year, and here's what we're going to have to do, you guys. And it's not funded, and it's not fun. And so I do appreciate this bill. I do appreciate the fact that it lays out very specifically how we would like to see our schools work with the community of families and students and teachers. And I do appreciate you bringing this forward to us today. Thank you.
Representative Herr, and then we're going to do a quick break, and then we'll bring it back up for a vote after we talk about possible amendments.
Thank you,
Representative
Madam
Herr.
Chair and Representative Kunish-Pudin. I just wanted to make this comment in case if the principals weren't here after the break. I wanted to just say that I really do applaud their work. This bill doesn't do anything to prevent them from continuing to collaborate and come up with new solutions that outside of suspending a student. And they were talking about culturally specific responses or practices, and I'm like, yes, that's great. And that this bill doesn't prevent you from doing that either. And so I want to make sure that this doesn't become a conversation about pitting parents and teachers against each other, because this is not what that is about at all, or private schools against public schools, or it has nothing to do with any of those things. We know there are good teachers. We know there are teachers that need help and support. We know there are good administrators doing great work. They can continue all of that great work. The teachers who are doing a great job managing their classrooms now, they get to continue doing that under this bill. It doesn't change any of that. What it does is provide new resources and tools to help teachers so that they can help better manage that classroom. And so I just want to make sure that principals understand that I'm applauding their work as well. And I think that they're doing a great job, and this bill allows them to continue to do that great job.
Thank you, Representative Herr. Members, we are in recess until 12:50 or 12:52. Please be back in your seats.